Welcome to the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast, hosted by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. After nearly 20 years exploring the world of conspiracy culture, we are taking our guests and listeners on a guided tour of the rabbit hole. Our mission? To discover where the truth lies. Well, episode 2, and we're still here, Neil.
It's not bad, is it?
The reptiles didn't get us.
No. But, you know, they're probably biding their time, Brent, so I don't want to get too cocky.
Well, there's two options. They are either don't exist, or we did such a good job of covering up, they're letting us live.
That's possible, unless it's a double bluff. Who knows?
Today, our guest is Steve, aka Brian Kurvie, the Conspiracist. You may know him from his viral 5G conspiracy video on Twitter. It is absolutely hilarious. This is satire spot on. How you doing, mate?
All right, gentlemen. Yourself, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. There's a question we need to know, and we need to know what brought this character to life. Why are you doing this? What is the story, mate?
For a bit of a laugh, really. I mean, that's purely how it started. Behind the Curve, actually, if I had to put a point on it, was when Behind the Curve came on Netflix, I was just finding it hilarious, because it is hilarious, and quite tame as well. It's not so off-putting that, you know, you can't watch it a couple of times and share it with your mates. And I remember just being down the gym and I just started thinking of sketches and stuff like that, and I thought, you know what, I could do one on Flat Earth quite easily. It's so dry a topic, and that's always been my kind of sense of humour anyway. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to come up with this character. And quite quickly it went to a few hundred subs and ended up appearing on a couple of channels, and I've just enjoyed it ever since, really. I've never had any... It's not like I've lost a friend or anything to conspiracies and felt passionate about helping people. I don't know, some other people's motivation is. It's, and you know what, I think to an extent as well, I feel like flat earthers are just funny. They're not. You're not insulting like a group of people who's. You can have a go at religion until the cows come home, and poking fun at the concept of the earth is flat. You can tell there's a couple of inspirations from real life flat earthers in there, but I don't hone in on anyone. And I think to an extent, I just felt like it was a good route into comedy in the first place. It's a lot of material. Having said that, the first actual videos I did before my character was just a couple of little just commentary videos, you know, where I played clips from Behind the Curve and paused it and just took the piss out of it and then carried on watching, kind of thing. Almost a bit like mirroring it like Simon Dan, Creaky Blinder, that type of video. And then I just started to play this character in real life to my friends and coming up with absolute nonsense.
So you weren't convinced by Beyond the Curve or Behind the Curve or whatever it's called?
No. I mean, that's what's quite good about that show. It's not really, it's never going to get, hopefully, that show is never going to get anyone because it's a Netflix thing.
Yeah. I think you'd be surprised.
The stuff I've seen people believe in, as I'm sure you guys have, is...
So what's your sort of general attitude to conspiracy theories, or conspiracy theories in inverted commas? Like, what's your take? Do you believe we went to the moon? Did Lee Harvey Oswald kill JFK? Are reptilian overlords controlling the planet? Actually, we did that one last week. So that's case closed, that is. Unless, of course, that's exactly what they want you to think.
Well, you never know. That's the thing. They're all so powerful and imaginary. Anything can happen, you know? I think I'm lucky that I got into it through Flat Earth. I've always had that angle of coming into it with a light heart and very empathetic to the fact that it's daft, Flat Earth. There's nothing malicious about it. And I remember having a discussion with some people on Facebook who are part of the debunker community as I started doing stuff. And I was like, yeah, but, you know, it's not really, there's no harm in it, is there? And one of them was like, well, the thing is, unfortunately, it can go down a rabbit hole. And that's when I started I'd heard of anti-vaxxers. Obviously, they're a lot more prevalent now because of the pandemic. But once you believe the earth is flat, there's nothing you're not prepared to believe.
You start going down different rabbit holes, exactly. That's the problem. Obviously, this show's about conspiracy theories. And the problem is, like, when it comes to conspiracism, you know, you believe in this one thing, then you start becoming a conspiracist.
And ironically, that's not free thinking or investigatory or anything like that. That's being part of a club, which is, you know, a lot of the time essentially why people get involved in that sort of thing, because it's new, it's exciting, it gives them a group of people who are like-minded that they feel at home with. You know, it gives people, to a degree, it gives people comfort. It doesn't mean that this is, again, what the show is about. It doesn't mean that all conspiracy theories are bunkum. It just means that some of them are, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's the upshot of it. I mean, it's like we were chatting about before. There are things that should be investigated and should have you kind of got, my opinion is, and I got this from behind the curve, actually, when the actual scientists at NASA were talking, no, not at NASA, at Caltech, were talking about how you kind of, they were just, flat earthers in particular, were kind of like, scientists that were let go, they're not done necessarily, some of them are, but they've got the curiosity of a scientist. They're passionate about researching and finding out stuff. And the term fallen down the rabbit hole is so true. It's sad to see that you get these people wasting something that they could be really good at on something as daft as flat earth.
Yeah, that's something we're trying to show people, like with me and Neil ourselves. Like, we've both been down these rabbit holes for 20 years between us, you know?
Yeah.
And we're not basement-dwelling, tinfoil hat-wearing people, you know, not jobs. Yeah,
that's it. A lot of them aren't.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of very passionate, very nice people. Flat Earth more so, you get a lot more cool people. And I think this is, if where my first introduction was Flat Earth, everything else it's been a slow introduction. If I'd first come across Holocaust deniers, for example, they're a dark type of person.
Yeah.
I think Eric Dubé does actually deny the Holocaust.
I think after a point when you're a flat earther, you've got to deny everything else as well. Yeah.
This is the point. This is the sort of the unfairness and the sort of, for want of a better phrase, the danger of it is, as you've quite rightly said, people that get into conspiracy theories or into alternative research, they are interested in helping people. They want to find out the truth. They want to unearth inequalities and the bad things in the world and show them so that these problems can get sorted.
Yep.
And this is why it's horrible when you get the sort of the grift angle where people basically play on those, you know, those really nice instincts. Like, for example, QAnon. You know, everybody who's involved in QAnon thinks that they're fighting against sort of evil people who are killing and eating and raping children. That's a nice person that wants to stop that. It's just that energy has been, as you quite rightly said, that energy has been misdirected like a Catherine wheel that's fallen off its stick.
I've never found the need to, and I've stayed away from ever getting at anyone particularly. You know, I know there's quite a few grudges amongst the debunkers and the flat earthers. Like, some of them are for show to an extent, like boxing matches. They hype each other up and stuff like that about their, and that's cool. Their channels are great. But I've chosen to never particularly. I don't ever want to be attacking anyone, like I've seen others do. And I know, like, you know, I always try to have the moral high ground of if I do get any abuse off of them online, I just don't even. I actually just, people who are full-on conspiracy theorists who follow me, if they're hesitant or vaccine hesitant or they got their doubts about stuff in general, I let them be. I let them follow me. A few of them do, and they don't do me any grief. Sometimes I see someone follow me and I quickly check out who they are, and if they're sharing loads of QAnon stuff, I just block them. I don't want that in my life. I'm not here to be a rival with someone. One thing I'm always really mindful of as well is I don't want to make anyone's mental health worse. You know, I actually lost a very, very good friend to full-on paranoid schizophrenia. But mental health is a passion of mine to just be. I'm just very mindful of it, and I'd hate to ever A, put someone further down a rabbit hole, or B, actually cause a conspiracy by accident. The only thing I ever did on vaccines before the pandemic was a really brief, really obvious story about when my mate had a vaccine when we were kids and he shot himself.
Yeah, I saw that actually.
Yeah, we're climbing a tree. But I've always been terrified, in fact, like borderline terrified of actually causing. That's why I got really hot of Matt Groening, the writer of Simpsons, where he writes The Simpsons and he calls it like rubber band reality. So he slowly stretches out reality to the point where Homer's flying through Springfield on some pig, and then he releases it and it goes back to reality. That's what I've always tried to get more and more outlandish as the script goes on, and then every sort of periodically I just say something that's blatantly, obviously a joke and a parody, and I never ever pretend it's not a parody. Someone says, "Is this satire?" Like, yes, straight away. I'd be mortified if I ever made someone worse, you know? Like, I don't ever talk about 9/11 either, because out of respect. separate subject. I don't know why I got that in there, but it's just one of my philosophies. And the Ukraine thing at the moment, I'm not making any jokes about that. COVID, I didn't do it until I didn't make any cracks. I did it first, and then I deleted it because I thought it through. And but yeah, now I'm prepared to talk about vaccines because it's almost done and dusted.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to put anyone off that getting a vaccine. That was my biggest thing.
Yeah, it's good. Responsible.
Yeah,
I mean, well, the rest of the conspiracy world really isn't that responsible, considering.
That's the malicious part of it when they turn it into money and the grift. And of course, everyone. I personally never made a penny out of my videos just because I'm not at that stage yet. And people like the debunkers that have big channels, of course, they shouldn't be making their money, but it's honest money because they're talking honest science. It's the money making grift. People like Mark Steele. How much are you into the 5G stuff? Do you know much about it?
Well, we know of it.
Yeah, not into it, but yeah.
No.
Do you know Mark Steele?
Yeah.
So he just sits there with his little fucking. He wants it to look like a bunker. He thinks of himself as Hitler in the Third Reich, but as a good guy somehow. Just being the final butt that everyone listens to, and he's happy to send his minions out to do his work. They're getting arrested, they're getting court summons and fines and stuff on his behalf. They're pawns in his game, and it's the same with Eric Dubay, I feel, and David Icke.
Yeah, it comes to a point where basically what he's saying is dangerous. It could be detrimental to people's health. Like, he's fine and good to pretend that the moon's a spaceship or whatever, like, and stuff that doesn't really affect you. But if you're telling people stuff that could literally hurt them in the middle of a national emergency, if you're so willing to take the praise and the lionization from the fans because, you've done the very brave thing of telling them exactly what they want to hear, then you've got to take the consequences for, the bad advice. It seems only fair, really.
I've never thought of it quite in those terms, where they want the praise and the kudos. I saw that you had The Skeptic of the North. I watched that Death by Conspiracy. I listened, rather, to that Death by Conspiracy.
Yeah.
I almost felt for the guy that, not in the grand scheme of things, but when they were confronting the guy who led Gary Mattthews down the rabbit hole, or was accused of leading Gary Mattthews down the rabbit hole, my empathy extended to him as well. I was sort of putting myself in his shoes because I've got all the empathy in the world for people with spiritual beliefs. And I looked at him and thought, how gutted would you feel knowing that, how much is he going to question, even though he sort of was able to wash his hands of it legally and on the show, but, he's getting grief in public. Probably rightly so, to a degree. I don't know enough about it to have an opinion, but that's got to eat him up. And part of me was a bit like, this is the consequence. You make your bed, you lie in it, but that's a shit day, isn't it?
Well, he's done something very, very stupid, but he's done it with the very best of intentions. Like, he's wrong. He's bang wrong, right? But he's not been wrong to be an arsehole, has he? Again, this is sort of ties in with today's show and stuff like that, where a lot of these conspiracy theories, they have either broader ramifications or they have sources that people don't actually understand. Like, for in the last episode, we were talking about the anti-Semitic tropes that are tied to the reptilian theory. And 9 out of 10 people who are spreading that theory have got no idea of the connotations of Jewish people and that sort of stuff. But it's that sort of soft selling, that normalization, if you will, of essentially Nazi propaganda through something as silly and harmless or as seemingly ridiculous as an episode of Doctor Who, which is essentially what it was. Like, this is why, again, these things need talking about. These things need examining. There's a big thing that they talk about all the time in the alternative media: question everything. It's like, all right, fine, let's question everything.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I think you said in this episode as well that it becomes question everything, becomes be a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian.
Yeah.
It's healthy that's what scientists do. And that's how scientific consensus is formed. One of the things I've always remembered, I'm assuming you both watched Conspiracy Cats at some point.
Yeah.
He was in a debate with someone. He said, the thing with science is they're very reclusive people, scientists, quite often, or not necessarily reclusive, but they're very introvert, academic people. They don't go out and get absolutely wasted and, they don't go and take drugs on a Saturday and go to drum and bass nights and go to festivals. They're not party goers. Their idea of a good time on a Saturday night is cracking open a bottle of whiskey, getting some beers in, whatever, sitting down and going over a newly published paper by one of their peers and tearing it to shreds. For their career, for their ego, for their pride, for their hobby, for their exercise. And there's tens of thousands of people doing this all across the world whenever there's a new paper released. Yeah. That's the scrutiny it comes under. That's why I'm confident with current scientific consensus. Like the whole argument of, but you don't know, you're just taking someone else's word for it. Like, yes, I am. Yes, absolutely I am. The person that studied it for 25 years, yes, I'll take his opinion.
Yes.
No problem. Because that's what they do. That's what they go through. Everyone has their field. I can tell you, my specific field was cocktail bartending and consultancy and that in hospitality, which is a very meaningless pastime. It's just become a career. But these people's equivalent to the knowledge that I know I've acquired is of a really important topic, a very specific topic with a lot more resources, a lot more money behind it. So that's what I'm confident taking people's opinions and stuff, because no one's ever going to know everything about everything. So even Einstein would have had to take the opinions of someone else and go, that's true.
Yeah. One more quick question about Brian Kurvie before we get into this. Is the Man United attire part of the joke?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I'm a Man United fan. Funny side. Well, I'm not. It was Man United or West Ham because my best friend is West Ham. I thought it would just be a permanent, ongoing joke against him for a laugh. Some people would laugh. It'd be like West Ham, anyone that's anti-West, or like a Chelsea fan at Tottenham. But it's ultimately funnier. This person's so deluded, and they're a Man United fan. There were some deleted scenes in my first couple of episodes that were talking about us winning the league this year, and how Paul Pogba's going to have a great season and stuff like that. Like obvious bullshit. But I laugh at myself. Like I'm a Man United fan, have been all my life. Being Southern, obviously, I'm a Man United fan. Yeah, it's deliberate.
That is the only thing I wanted to know. Right, podcast over. Laters. All right, some people wanted to know exactly what it was our premise and layout is of this show. So, first we're going to hear an overview of what this conspiracy theory is and what it claims. Next, we will look at the current proponents of this theory. Then we will examine the evidence used to affirm the theory. This will lead us to explore what the actual source and root of the conspiracy is. After this, with the evidence and our reactions in mind, we will conclude with a final discussion about whether or not this theory has any weight to it. Today, the topic is cultural Marxism.
Oh.
Neil, what is cultural Marxism?
Cultural Marxism is a theory that Western society and its Judeo-Christian values are being subverted by a secret Marxist Jewish plot. A group of Marxist Jewish intellectuals connected to an institution called the Frankfurt School infiltrated academia, the media, and science. And the tools that they use to undermine Western society are multiculturalism, race mixing, feminism, the 60s counterculture, the promotion of violence and sex, and the tolerance and promotion of LGBT people or any type of progressive ideology.
Sounds legit.
It sounds, yeah. Now this is a surprisingly common theory. This has been knocked around by a lot of politicians. It's been brought up in the Houses of Commons. Mm-hmm. Marjorie Taylor Greene was speaking about it earlier. Every single sort of alternative media person has spoken about the theory at some point. It ties into things like the trans agenda, the supposed woke agenda, the recent worries about sex education and critical race theory, and various other things like that. And basically, in order to explain this, first we need to explain a few things, like, for example, what is Marxism, what is capitalism, what is the Frankfurt School. Now, capitalism is the economic system that we actually live in today. And the best and easiest way of explaining this is the means of production, which basically means factories, institutions, corporations, those types of things. They're privately owned. So there's some very, very rich guy, and Elon Musk, say, that actually owns this factory. Now, Marx was living in London, and he basically came up with this idea that capitalism was bad. The reason that he felt that capitalism was bad was to do with the concept of exploitation. Now, what this basically means is that because industry is profit-driven, basically every business exists to make money and to make money for its workers and to, make people wealthier. In order for that company or corporation or industry to be profitable, they have to make more out of you than they pay you. So put very, very simply, if you work for £10 an hour, you need to be making that company more than £10 an hour in order for that company to be successful. And in that, Marx found the inherent unfairness of capitalism in as much as basically by necessity, the workers are being exploited. So that's what he felt was wrong with capitalism. Now, there is a system that exists within capitalism called socialism. Now, socialism basically says that capitalism is absolutely fine. You can do capitalism, but what we need a safety net that stops the poorest people in society from really struggling. So, free healthcare, free policing, free access to law and education, that types of things. Now, Marx thought, well, that's all very well and good, but I don't think that's going to happen, because why would these wealthy people bother to basically give up some of their money just to help the workers out? And so what Marx felt was that there must be a revolution of the workers, the proletariat. The proletariat must become so dissatisfied with the ruling class, which is the bourgeoisie, that they decide to essentially murder them and take over the means of production by basically redistributing the wealth throughout the country, taking over the factories, the farms, and basically then the entire civilization works together to make it great for everybody. And this will eventually lead to a utopia. Now, there is one massive problem with this concept of Marxism, in as much as it doesn't work. It's never worked, because basically what happens is you get to a stage which Lenin described as, after the revolution, that you needed a benevolent dictator. You needed somebody to basically hold the reins and steer the society along in order to make it work, to go to that eventual utopia where everybody gets everything that they want and everybody's happy. The problem is that after Lenin came in, you had people like Stalin and Mao who realized that, being a dictator is bloody fun and nobody tells me what to do. I can get up whenever I like, people don't mention it if I don't bother to brush my hair properly. It's ace. There are other fringe benefits to being a dictator, but those are just the ones off the top of my head that I thought. But anywho, so the problem is that communism doesn't work. But the idea of Marxism was that essentially the means of production will be owned by the people through the state, and essentially everything will be provided for everybody. Now,
so what has this got to do with woke dinosaurs?
With woke dinosaurs,
yeah.
Right. Well, there is this school called the Frankfurt School. Now, it came about in 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany, and it was started by a chap called Felix Weil and another bloke called Karl Grunberg. Now, these were essentially Marxist theorists, and a lot of them were Jewish. And the reason they set up the Frankfurt School was because they were confused, because they'd been promised all of these things by Marxist theory, like including the utopia, but they'd witnessed it not happening. In fact, they'd witnessed the very opposite of that happening. They'd witnessed the Soviet Union and Stalin becoming a totalitarian dictatorship, an absolutely terrible place to live, ruled by fear and secret murders, essentially. They also noticed that basically on the other side of the political spectrum, on the right wing, fascism had happened. It was the beginnings of Nazi Germany and fascist Spain, fascist Italy, and they just could not get this around their heads. At the same time, they also felt that capitalism was also totalitarian in a sense, because although you get lots of trinkets, essentially whoever decides to sell those trinkets gets to decide what is available for you to buy. In a more subtle sense and in a more placating sense, they felt that capitalism was also totalitarian. So they set up this school of thought called the Frankfurt School to examine these things, to basically to criticize the institutions, because they felt that all three paths that were in the world were fundamentally totalitarian and harmful to the very essence of being a human being. And so one of the main things that they used for this was critical theory. Now, critical theory is a critique of society and the culture to reveal and challenge power structures. So it looks at established ideas of normality and what's correct and what's considered to be good, and it criticizes them. It criticizes them in ways that haven't been done before. And the idea is to alter this to better suit human needs rather than the system itself. From the Frankfurt School, the very famous theorists that came out of this were people like Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, Kurt Lewin, and various other people. Now, the idea is that this school, this Frankfurt School, and these Marxists, really what they wanted to do was they wanted to undermine Western culture. They weren't there to be sort of critical or to be academic in any way. No. It was actually a plot to surreptitiously use this as a smokescreen in order to spread Marxist theory surreptitiously into the Western world, into the Western culture, in order to cause so much discontent that the revolution would happen that way. And there's a number of people who are very, very, very sure that this is a real thing. Now, the first time that this came about as a theory, which was called cultural Marxism, was in 1992. So this is a relatively recent theory. It's just a pinch older than the reptilian theory, actually.
So 1992, and when was it founded?
The school was founded in 1929. In 1933, it moved to Vienna, and in 1935, it moved to New York and set up at Columbia University. And this was because basically Nazi Germany was coming about, and because they were principally Jews and principally Marxist, and those are two things that Nazis really don't dig. So they decided the best thing was to probably up sticks, go first to Vienna and then to America. And that has been interpreted in a number of ways. Some think that was far more sinister than it looks like on the surface.
So it's been around for 60 years before the conspiracy theory starts, yeah?
Yes, and most of the people that are involved in the conspiracy theory were dead before the idea started, and so weren't there to be able to rebut the arguments against them. But yes, although there's roots, which we'll discuss, going right back to the 60s, this wasn't spotted, if you will, by the theorists until the early 90s. Although they do harken back to some things that happened in the 60s and claim that, this is the plot unfolding in front of our eyes.
Coincidentally, around about the time when the internet was coming into prominence.
Yeah, it was about that time, but, and there are no coincidences.
Of course. I did a little bit of, I read up on it briefly as a...
You didn't want to say research then, did you?
Have you also become a bit repellent of the R word? Yeah. Yeah, so I've done my own research very briefly just to see what the topic was about, but I deliberately didn't go too much into it because I wanted to be, hearing it for the first time. I'm more just taking it in, really, to be honest. It sounds like a general, if in doubt, blame the Jews.
Well, we don't want to spoil anything, but there's certainly right up front, there's an element of that in as much as, yes, it is about blaming the Jews, but specific Jews. So, it might not be as bad as it sounds. So 1992 in Fidelio magazine. Now, Fidelio magazine is a magazine that's put out by the Schiller Institute. Now, the Schiller Institute is a think tank. Now, I don't know whether this will have a bearing on this particular evidence or not, but the main point that the Schiller Institute wants to get across in all its work is that there is an unnamed group in the world involved in financial institutions. And we don't know who these people are, but they are responsible for the entirety of the world's problems. Now, the Schiller Institute never names these people, but it's really striving to, prevent this group of people, whoever they may be, from causing these problems in the world. And basically, there's this article that came out in 1992 by a gentleman called Michael Mendecino, and he was actually connected to this political group called the Lind and LaRouche group, and the Lind and LaRouche group are quite far right in some of their thinkings. Now, this article that he wrote was called The New Dark Age, Frankfurt School and Political Correctness. And basically what he said is that the New Dark Age refers to America's abandonment of Judeo-Christian values and Renaissance ideals. Now, he's misusing the concept of the Renaissance there. What he means when he's saying Renaissance ideals is pretty stuff. Because what happened, the Renaissance essentially was when the Age of Enlightenment, where suddenly architecture and art and loads of things basically decided to start getting proper fancy, like proper like at your nan's house fancy, like really fancy. But the reason that this happened was because essentially religion had lost its overbearing grip. It didn't mean that religion didn't exist anymore, obviously, but essentially there was a move from thinking that the world was of God, it was under God, to being of God. So essentially it was the rise of certain burgeoning sciences and looking at the world in a different way. And so the irony of this particular statement is that basically it just means pretty things. It's actually anachronistic to what he's saying, but let's not get bogged down in facts too early on. So the New Dark Age refers to America's abandonment of Judeo-Christian values and Renaissance ideals. And what he basically said was that this is called the tyranny of ugliness. And it was a plot by György Lukács. Now, György Lukács was a Hungarian Jewish Marxist, and he was one of the very first people. He didn't found the Frankfurt School, but right at its inception, at its very first meeting, he was one of the people that spoke about it. And one of the things that he was very, very annoyed about was that Marxism hadn't taken hold. And one of his famous quotes is, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" And so Michael Mendecino says, the tyranny of ugliness was a plot by György Lukács and the Jewish intellectuals of the Frankfurt School. And this plot had three prongs to it. One, a constant criticism of culture, which would be encouraged by the teachings of Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin. And they were proponents of what I spoke about earlier, which is critical theory, which is essentially criticizing structures, established structures, to see who they really benefit and to try and use them for the betterment of mankind. But this has been interpreted as a way to basically just undermine Western civilization. And to an extent, this is true because critical theory doesn't offer any solutions. All it does is pick at things. I used to go out with a girl like that, and it does get tedious after a while. Anyway, they don't offer any solutions. They just offer this criticism. And basically the idea is that's what the point of critical theory is. So Mendecino said that by purely offering criticism, it creates alienation. Now, he also had a couple of strange ideas because he felt that one way to control public opinion is through the manipulation of sort of early advertising techniques. So, for example, if you see a poll in a newspaper that says, 80% of people think that Piers Morgan actually isn't a totally insufferable bastard, then you might be persuaded to go, well, okay, maybe if the majority of people think like that, maybe I've misjudged him. Like, I'd advise you to stick to your guns. But basically, like, that's a sort of very subtle way that a poll can dictate a result rather than actually report on a result. And Mendecino felt that Adorno and Walter Benjamin were using exactly these types of techniques in order to manipulate the public. The other thing that he felt that Adorno and Benjamin were using was modern art. Mendecino felt that modern art was crap. And by modern art, we mean abstract art. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Tate Gallery, stuff like, there's an apple on a house brick and that's worth 20 million quid. And like some trousers hung up with some rabbit ears attached to them, that's 40 million quid. Damien Hirst type stuff. Yeah. And essentially, he felt that the point of this was to make people stupid. There's no point to this art. It's ridiculous. It's there to ruin society. It's to cause alienation. And ultimately, this alienation, this is Mendecino's own words, will replace Christianity with socialism. The second prong of this attack was an attack on the family structure to promote women's rights, sexual liberation, and homosexuality in order to subvert the patriarchy. And, he felt that was coming directly out of the Frankfurt School. The third prompt of this attack was, to achieve this, the Frankfurt School encouraged the counterculture of the 1960s and promoted psychedelic drugs and promiscuity. Now, there's a degree of truth to that, in as much as Herbert Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich made certain proposals that they said that essentially sex was okay. They felt that it was all right to have sex with people, that you didn't need to stay with a partner or to get married. You didn't even need to stay within the bounds of what was considered normal. Like, and I mean normal at the time, because at the time homosexuality in some places was still illegal. They felt, particularly Wilhelm Reich, if it feels good, do it. In fact, Wilhelm Reich felt that the orgasm was basically the life force and that it could actually have beneficial effects. He also thought that he could cure cancer with orgone, which was extracted from the ether. And he also apparently was able to create clouds. I don't know whether anyone's seen the cloud busting video by Kate Bush, but that song and the video is based on the experiments of Wilhelm Reich, who came from the Frankfurt School. Oh. Sorry, I digress. This promiscuity was part of the counterculture, so that was essentially what Mendecino was getting at. He also said that the Frankfurt School were involved in the setting up of radio, TV, film, music, advertising, and the polling industries, which were all used as tools to control and pacify the masses. And art was replaced by entertainment. And there's a few quotes from this. He said, "Our children spend as much time sitting in front of the TV sets as they do in school, watching with glee scenes of torture and death, which might have shocked an audience in a Roman Colosseum. Music is everywhere, almost unavoidable, but it does not uplift or even tranquilize. It claws at the ears, sometimes spitting out an obscenity. Our plastic arts are ugly. Our architecture is ugly. Our clothes are ugly." Which is, a bitter indictment on Western civilization, I think. But hey-ho. He went on. He said, our universities, the cradle of our technological and intellectual future, have become overwhelmed by Comintern-style New Age political correctness. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, our campuses represent the largest concentration of Marxist dogma in the world. The irrational outbursts of the 60s have become institutionalized into a permanent revolution. Our professors glance over their shoulders, hoping the current mode will blow over before a student's denunciation obliterates a life's work. Some tape their lectures, fearing accusations of insensitivity by some enraged Red Guard. Students at the University of Virginia recently petitioned successfully to drop the requirement to read Homer, Chaucer, and other dead European males because such writings are considered ethnocentric, phallocentric, and generally inferior to more relevant third world, female, or homosexual authors. And he clarifies exactly why we're seeing all these ethnocentric homosexual authors in the universities undermining Western civilization. He says the task of the Frankfurt School was first to undermine the Judeo-Christian legacy through an abolition of culture, and second, to determine new cultural forms which would increase the alienation of the population, thus creating a new barbarism. To this task, gathered in and around the Frankfurt School, an incredible assortment of not only communists, but also non-party socialists, radical phenomenologists, Zionists, renegade Freudians, and at least a few members of the cult of Astarte. Now, it sounds like a right motley cavalcade of people there. He furthered this by saying, if you remember, one of the things that was going to undermine Western civilization to the point where it couldn't cope anymore was modern art. And he said that the purpose of modern art, literature and music must be to destroy the uplifting, therefore bourgeois potential of art, literature and music, so that man, bereft of his connection to the divine, sees his only creative option to be political revolt. The idea being that basically it reduces your creative outlets so much that literally the only thing that you can do for leisure time is to overthrow the state. And, we've all felt like that. But this was essentially the concern of Michael Mendecino. And this was as early as 1992 that he felt that this was a problem. Now, again,
This sounds so archaic even for 1992.
it does a bit, doesn't it? But essentially, some of what he's touching on there, like, is things that people will recognise. For example, what he said is the professors getting shouted down by their students, like for saying something that isn't, well, let's use the terminology of the time, hep. You know, what's not sort of up to speed. We've all seen that. In fact, you were saying before that there was the lady in Brighton who had views about trans identity, and she was hounded out of the university, essentially. These are things that do happen. How often and how unjustified they are is another section of the conversation. But here's the interesting thing about this theory is there are certain things that you can see that would resonate with people. Like, you know, it might seem quite strange. I don't know what he's talking about with the Frankfurt School. I don't understand what Marxism is about, for example. But I do know that I said something in front of some teenagers and they called me out for being out of touch. And so that was what Michael Mendecino was getting to. The second time that we hear this theory is the most popular retelling, and this is called The Roots of Political Correctness. And this was in the mid-90s, and it came from two people, Paul Weyrich and William Lind. Now, Paul Weyrich was involved in the John Birch Society, and he was the founder of the Heritage Foundation, also of the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation. And these were financed by people like Joseph Coors. Joseph Coors is the beer magnate who makes Coors beer, and he was involved in groups like the John Birch Society and the Heritage Foundation, the Council for National Policy. And the Kochs, Fred Koch was, these are the oil industry and the oil refinery industry. And Fred Koch is the father of the Koch brothers, one of whom recently died. And they are also connected with these think tanks like the Council for National Policy, the Heritage Foundation, the John Birch Society. Now, what happened was Paul Weyrich got his good friend William Lind to write an essay on this thing that he termed cultural Marxism, and he'd taken it from the Mendecino idea. Now, Paul Weyrich had recently written something called the Culture War letter. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of the Culture War. This is quite a sort of ongoing thing. It's never really sort of that well defined, if we're being brutally honest. But some people might notice some similarities to things we're talking about today. For example, the attack on traditional family values or traditional, what is termed traditional Western values. Now, Weyrich basically in this letter said that he felt that conservatives had lost the culture war. And so instead of engaging with society, what they should do is they should separate themselves from what he felt had become a corrupt mainstream society. He said, I believe that we've probably lost the culture war. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue and that it isn't going to be fought on other fronts. But in terms of society in general, we have lost. And that is why, even when we win in politics, our victories fail to translate into the policies that we believe are important. Therefore, what seems to me a legitimate strategy for us to follow is to look at ways to separate ourselves from the institutions that have been captured by the ideology of political correctness. What I mean by separation is, for example, what the homeschoolers have done. Faced with public school systems that no longer educate, but instead condition students with attitudes of political correctness, they have seceded. They have separated themselves from public schools and created new institutions, schools in their homes. And I think that we have to look at a whole series of possibilities for bypassing the institutions that are controlled by the enemy. If we expend our energies in fighting on the turf they have already controlled, we will probably not accomplish what we hope and may spend ourselves to the point of exhaustion. And he says that basically cultural Marxism and political correctness are synonymous, and that political correctness will lead to the destruction of Western values. Now, by political correctness, he clarifies exactly what he means by political correctness. He says, you can't approach the truth about a lot of subjects. If you do, you will be branded as racist, sexist, homophobic, insensitive, or judgmental. And yeah, I mean, there's a degree of truth again. Now, what Paul Weyrich's attitudes were, we'll come on to later, but he essentially was one of the founding members of what is considered the religious right movement in America. He was friends with Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell, and he actually helped found Jerry Falwell's political group, the Moral Majority. Through his connection to Billy Graham, there's a gentleman called Douglas Coe. Douglas Coe runs a religious organization which is called the Family, or sometimes the C Street Group. And they organized one of the most powerful lobbying institutions in American politics, the Prayer Breakfast, which is an annual event where essentially politicians come together with this religious organization, tell prayers, and have a bit of a tete-a-tete, and things get done behind the scenes, essentially. So what Weyrich's attitudes were very, very conservative. He was actually friends with people like Laszlo Pastor, who was a convicted Nazi collaborator. Anywho, this gives you an idea of where Weyrich's position is on the political spectrum. He said that the fact that blacks and openly gay men are on television is proof that this plot is taking place.
What?
I'm going to repeat that.
What?
The fact that blacks and openly gay men appear on television is proof that this plot is taking place. Now, we must remember this is a Marxist Jewish plot to undermine traditional Christian Judeo values by introducing multiculturalism and progressive values.
What point in history are we at this point? Because it almost feels like you're talking in the 50s, but you're not. I know you're not.
This was in the 90s. This was in the mid-90s. You're going to see this continues right to this day by some people who are very, very popular in sort of mainstream circles. So but we will come on to that.
I've got something to say about the way they go on about trans people these days and the gay community. It's just like, yeah, that's just put there just to wind people up. You know, that's an agenda. Shut up. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm itching for that.
I did warn you, man. This is a wacky one. This one, they actually incorporated a bit of evidence into it. They talked about two people. They talked about Herbert Marcuse, who you remember we mentioned before. They say that the proof that this plot is taking place is the Marcuse quote from the 60s that said, "A coalition of blacks, students, feminists, and homosexuals is a feasible vanguard of cultural revolution." And that's what Marcuse did actually say. He basically said that a coalition of blacks, students, feminists, and homosexuals is a feasible vanguard of cultural revolution. And this has been interpreted by Weyrich and Lind as proof that all of those things are a Marxist plot to flood the institutions and the media in the West with those particular things.
What was the proof, sorry?
The proof was Marcuse saying, and I quote, "A coalition of blacks, students, feminists, and homosexuals is a feasible vanguard for cultural revolution." I mean, it's been staring us in the face. But that's no, not just that. They did back it up with something else. They backed it up with the thoughts of an Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci. Now, Antonio Gramsci, he felt that Marxism had failed. He said that it just hadn't come about like as he expected to do, and it needed what he described as a cultural revolution. He felt that basically the fact that Christianity was quite prevalent in the West was one of these things that gave comfort to people in their lives, so they didn't feel agitated enough to form the revolution. And he also felt that basically culture itself kind of held up the values of capitalism with his theory of cultural hegemony. He basically said, the bourgeoisie use cultural institutions to maintain power in capitalist societies. The bourgeoisie develops a hegemonic culture using ideology rather than violence or coercion. Hegemonic culture propagates its own values and norms so that they become the common sense values of all and thus maintain the status quo. Cultural hegemony is therefore used to maintain consent to the capitalist order. So his idea is that basically once you're in capitalism, it's quite comfy and nice, and you've got so much to abandon that you don't really want to have the revolution, even if that would be beneficial to you, because you'll have to get rid of your DVDs and CDs and knickknacks and stuff like that. And so Gramsci felt that The only way that Marxism would succeed was what he called the long march through the institutions. He felt that Marxism needed to pervade culture in order to look at it. And therefore, he founded what was termed neo-Marxism. Neo-Marxism is the idea that institutions such as the church actually help to create and perpetuate the class divide. So from that idea that Marxism needs to go into culture, and the quote of Herbert Marcuse, those people never met. In fact, they were in completely different countries, and Gramsci was in prison at the time. But because of those two theories, that is the evidence that basically cultural Marxism seeks to destroy Western culture and evoke a revolution of the proletariat through a combination of psychological repression and by removing societal inhibitions. There's 4 ways in which it will do this. 1, critical theory will undermine traditional family structure and government, and it encourages the ideas of victims and oppressors. So the idea of looking at systems and saying that basically perhaps these systems are inherently unfair or inherently racist or inherently sexist, that will create the idea that you might be a victim. It's not the system, it's the criticism of the system that creates that idea. And that will ultimately undermine Western society and cause it to collapse. The second, Theodore Adorno came up with this idea of the authoritarian personality. And on this, it was a scale of how fascist you are, essentially. It was what he called his F scale. And William Lind and Paul Weyrich, for some reason, feel that the authoritarian personality in the F scale is used to paint right-wing figures as fascist. But we'll come back to that later. They also felt that free love, as promoted by Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich, and homosexuality, which is promoted in general by the Frankfurt School, just undermines the sanctity of Western civilization. It's the thin end of the wedge. It'll just lead to, horses eating each other in the street and literal hell on earth. And finally, that Marcuse's concept of repressive tolerance is seen as a way to silence the right wing. Now, what repressive tolerance is the idea that there needs to be a point where you stop being tolerant. If somebody came into your house and started just stabbing you in the arm, and you were like, well, we've got to be tolerant to this person, we've got to be, because you've got to be nice to everybody, sooner or later, you're going to bleed to death. Might take a long time. And so what Marcuse said is that basically, no, being tolerant just allows, for want of a better phrase, and I'm not quoting Marcuse here, but it allows bastards to thrive. So what he suggested is that basically there comes to a point where you stop being tolerant of other people if they're oppressive to you. Lind and Weyrich also felt that for some reason, I don't know why, but they felt that this was a way to silence the right wing. Lind also interpreted, if you remember I said that at the beginning, to escape fascist Germany, these Marxist Jews had gone from Germany in 1933 to Vienna and then gone even further to America in 1935. Lind interprets that as a Nazi plot of Jewish Marxists sent over to America. Commie Nazis. That's the theory as purported by William Lind. Now, the next time that this was purported was Paul Weyrich and William Lind were basically like the go-to cultural Marxist. William Lind's that guy. He's a bit weird. He looks a little bit like a sort of woodland animal, but he's got white hair and sort of big glasses. He looks a bit sort of hedgehoggy. But yeah, he was him and Paul Weyrich were the main proponents of this theory for a long time.
And some of his videos are still on YouTube, aren't they?
Loads are, in fact, yeah. In fact, and the Culture War letter you can find in its entirety. All of these articles we're going to link on our Twitter and Facebook pages and stuff. But yeah, all of this still exists. It's not hidden. The next time that it sort of reared its head, this theory, in any prominent way, was in 2008 in the Catholic newspaper, which is called The Wanderer. A bloke called Timothy Mattthews wrote an article called "The Frankfurt School: Conspiracy to Corrupt," which is quite catchy. And basically it said, and I don't want anyone to panic, but the Frankfurt School came to the USA to carry out Satan's work. So, it's a commie, Nazi, Jewish, satanic conspiracy to undermine Christian, Western Judeo values with
It's like a snowball.
It's the only
isn't it? Like, it's insidious. That's what it is. It's got tentacles everywhere. So under the influence of Satan, the Frankfurt School sought to destroy the traditional Christian family by starting a culture war using critical theory and Marcuse's polymorphous perversity. He felt that society was detrimental to Eros. Eros is what is called, is essentially the life force, as opposed to Thanatos, which is the death force. What he basically means is pleasure. And what he said was, in society, there are certain things that stop you from experiencing pleasure in the way that you would want to. Some of those are good, like this is why you don't get people sort of masturbating in the street. Some of those he felt were bad, that basically, you know, repress people and cause people to have sort of a bad time because they're not able to express themselves as they truly want to be. But Timothy Mattthews felt that this was actually satanic. And as well as part of this satanic movement, Satan, through the Frankfurt School, was going to encourage women's rights, homosexuality, and the breakdown of the patriarchy by creating a female-centric culture. So these are big things to be concerned about.
I guess we're going to speak about it later, but I can see from a Christian perspective why I guess they would say those sorts of things. From a evangelical American Christian version.
It is certainly a hard line, isn't it? I mean, but if you were to think that homosexuality is
a sin and such and such.
Yeah, if you felt that basically the patriarchal society was ingrained into your ideology, was the sort of thing that made America great, you can see why these things would be considered a threat to your current ideology.
Yeah, I can see where they're coming from. I definitely do not agree with them in the slightest.
Understanding their point, like, as in not from their point of view, but just looking at it from their perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like fear of losing what they think they have, some sort of shred of power. I don't know.
Well, what this letter accuses the Frankfurt School, who you remember is powered by Satan at this point, what it accuses them of doing, this is a far more elaborate plot. Well, it's the same thing essentially, but there's different sort of techniques that they're using. One, the creating of the idea of racism offences. So what they're saying is that the Frankfurt School pushed the idea of racism as something that should be illegal, or that persecution should be illegal. That it was the Frankfurt School that promoted this. And Timothy Mattthews feels that that is detrimental to society. The idea of holding people to account for racism was a creation of the Frankfurt School that he feels is wrong. Two, causing continual change to create confusion. Now, I'm getting older. Everything's starting to confuse me. I don't understand how my phone works. I'm having a bloody hard time programming the video. Yes, I've still got a video. I can't get it to work. But yes, apparently this is the Frankfurt Society. They are creating constant change in society to cause confusion. The third thing that they'll do is they'll teach sex and homosexuality to children. And again, we do see that sex education is being taught to children. Telling people about homosexual people is a thing that happens. And the fourth one is the undermining of schools and the teacher's authority. Now, some of you who've been paying close attention might say, but that completely contradicts the third one about teaching sex, because if you undermine the teacher's authority, they won't care about the sex. Don't worry about that. Number 5, the destruction of US identity through immigration. Now, that is something that will appeal to some people. But immigration, I think, has been a hot button topic since the dawn of immigration. It is slightly ironic as the USA is a civilization brought about by people emigrating to it. Yeah. But that is one of the things that he feels is a problem. Promoting excess drinking. Hang on. That's ridiculous. 7, the emptying of churches. 8, creating an unreliable legal system with bias against victims of crime. We could see that, but again, that's an interesting one. This is one of those things where it very much depends on your perspective. If you believe homosexuality is a sin, if you are genuinely concerned about immigration, you can see these as hot button topics. I think any of us could see the confusion and potentially an unreliable criminal system. because anyone can point to innumerable cases where they feel there's been a travesty of justice. 9, creating dependency on the state and state benefits. That could be argued that more people are on state benefits, and there are crises of money at the moment. 10, controlling and dumbing down of the media. And 11, and this is the ultimate goal of the Frankfurt School, is encouraging the breakdown of the family unit. So that is what Timothy Mattthews' particular take on that was. There is a little side theory that is connected to the Frankfurt School that we'll just touch on because it's a bit kind of fun. Have either of you heard the idea that Theodore Adorno, far from being a sort of crusty old Marxist Jewish intellectual, he actually wrote all of the Beatles' music?
I have heard that.
Yes. Have you not heard that? Like, Steve, right? Well, like, yeah, this is the theory. The theory is that, as again, some explain it as part of a Marxist plot to undermine Western values. Some people just say he did it because the Beatles are part of a sort of a more general mind control program. But essentially, the theory put forward mostly by a bloke called John Coleman is that Theodore Adorno wrote all the Beatles songs. So
he's got bars.
You know what we're experiencing right now with the Pizzagate. Trump's going to save the. It sounds like a very much rehashed, reworded version of that. It just recycled a very broad theory, but it hasn't gone away. Accusing the trans agenda.
Are you suggesting that potentially in the alternative media, there's, as opposed to free thinking, just repetition of mantras? I suppose you might be onto something there. The next person who was pushing this particular theory is somebody that people might have heard of, or they certainly have heard of his legacy, Andrew Breitbart. Andrew Breitbart, who started the magazine and the website Breitbart. That was later taken over by Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon. Both of those are connected to the program Cambridge Analytica, which is a particular favourite of mine. Before Andrew Breitbart died, he was a large proponent of the concept of cultural Marxism. He claimed that American presidents Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were part of this cultural Marxist plot, and that they were corrupted by a love of Marx and Hegel, and ultimately they were a plot to destroy the US Constitution. He also says that he gives us a broader explanation as to why cultural Marxism is so prevalent everywhere. It's because George Soros finances it. So this is, you see, it's
the entrance of the boogeyman.
Absolutely. So George Soros finances this, and what they use is something that's called trickle-down intellectualism. And the idea is that basically they spread this theory through the universities, thus to using Marcuse's own theory, use the students as this potential vanguard for revolution. And Andrew Breitbart said that they have a very particular book. There's almost like a manual that sort of teaches you how to be a cultural Marxist. And this particular book is written by a chap called Saul Alinsky. This particular book is called 12 Rules for Radicals. And Andrew Breitbart claims that this book is a how-to guide for being a cultural Marxist and for spreading cultural Marxism to the masses. He says, if you want to know how it's done and you want to know how to do it effectively, you just need to read 12 Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd love to elaborate on it, but that's all he's ever said about it. Yeah.
Well, no quotes? No quotes?
No quotes. But Saul Alinsky, that's the takeaway. The big takeaway is that it's Saul Alinsky, financed by George Soros, and US Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were also part of the plot. And, if you can't take Andrew Breitbart's word for it, where are we?
Well, we could go read Saul Alinsky.
We could. I have. And we'll come back to this later.
Excellent. Now, for complete transparency,
yes,
you did study this at university, am I correct?
Well, kind of. I didn't study the Frankfurt School. I did a little bit of critical theory and a little bit of Marxist psychology, essentially. By Marxist psychology, that doesn't mean sticking someone in a gulag until they become a Marxist. It's a psychology degree, and so as part of that, there's different ways of looking at it. So I'm quite familiar with some of the works of Adorno and Horkheimer, and that's why I know a little bit about Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich and some of the other things. And so once we've gone through the evidence, I'm actually going to go over some of the things that I know about the Frankfurt School. And this is why this one particularly piqued my interest, because, well, I don't wish to spoil it, but it piqued my interest because I was familiar with the source material. And so I was like, okay, that's an interesting take on what they're trying to say. One of the most popular people that actually spread the idea of cultural Marxism is Jordan Peterson himself. That's right, the Canadian Jordan Peterson. He first...
Who's that?
The guy, the tall, thin intellectual who likes you to clean your room.
Never heard of him.
Bless him. He basically, this is what sort of got him started in the sphere of the internet. Like he was a professor of psychology, but he wasn't really sort of known in a sort of broader sense until he started rallying against the C16 bill. C16 was a bill that had come in that was talking about trans identity in Canada. And Jordan Peterson said that this bill was cultural Marxism. He said that he wouldn't stick by it, that by accidentally misgendering a person, you could be locked up. You could be literally locked up for making a mistake. And he wouldn't pander to somebody's, I believe he called it a mental illness. But basically, he really made this a hill to die on. He got sort of reprimanded by his university, and he still stuck to his guns. He got very famously into arguments with his students, where they were basically saying, look, if I just asked you to call me her or she out of consideration, would you do it? And Jordan Peterson's take on this was no, because I'm being forced to do it. And this is totalitarianism. He basically says that this is, again, the thin end of the wedge. It starts with C16 saying that you can go to prison. You can literally go to prison these days for accidentally misgendering somebody, says Jordan Peterson. And he says that criticisms of sexism, criticisms of racism will ultimately end up, in his own words, in the gulag, which is a reference to Soviet sort of prisons in Siberia.
Wow.
He basically implies that cultural Marxism is to blame for all sorts of things that are degrading Western civilization, one of which is gay marriage, which I was surprised to find out that he's actually very opposed to, because he feels that it undermines the institution of Christian marriage. He also thinks that cultural Marxism, which he refers to as a grand conspiracy of Marxists. Don't know if that phrase is loaded in any way. So who knows what he means by that. But he says that this grand conspiracy of Marxism will ultimately destroy Western civilization. And he also says that it's basically all over the universities. And his views that it's all over the universities have been echoed by other people, including Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk, who basically just agree with him that this is a way to get students to be hyper woke, hyper worried about racism, hyper worried about sexism and misgendering, to the point where basically it just undermines everything that the Western civilization has stood for the last few years. Now, what he also says, though, he sometimes calls it neo-Marxism, and he sometimes calls it postmodernism. He blames it on a French philosopher called Jacques Derrida, who basically had this idea called deconstructionism. It wasn't actually anything to do with the Frankfurt School, but Jordan Peterson says that deconstruction is essentially the same thing. Marxism looks at conflict. Because this creates conflict, this is the same thing. It's almost like a shifting of Marxism to a new playing field. They're not looking at class consciousness anymore. They're looking at class conflict. They're looking at race conflict, sex conflict, gender conflict, that sort of thing. And he says that ultimately the whole point is to tear everything down, to deconstruct everything and to destroy it, which will ultimately result in the destruction of Western Christian Judeo values, unfortunately. So that's Jordan Peterson. Now, again, he basically just says this is a thing. He cites Derrida, he cites C16, he talks about the grand conspiracy, he talks about the undermining of Western civilization, and he basically just refers to it in kind of oblique terms. He actually had a debate about it with Slavoj Zizek, who is a very, very prominent communist. It didn't go very far, that particular debate, but we will come back to that later. I've had people talking to me about it, saying basically Black Lives Matter is an example of neo-Marxist postmodernism. And it's like, wow, that's a word salad. But they've got that from Jordan Peterson. When asked to sort of back that up, they go, well, it's about deconstruction. It's about, creating conflict. It's shifting the playing fields, and it's causing that divide. And ultimately, it'll lead towards a revolution of ultra wokeism, which will lead to basically like what his chief concern is that you won't be able to say anything. It'll be so politically correct that if you say the wrong thing, you'll be ultimately pilloried to the point where you'll be thrown in prison. And there'll be this sort of dictatorship of ultimate niceness to the point where it's militant. And that's what Jordan Peterson says. We've got three more bits, and then it's onto the rebuttal. And these are the sort of the horrible ones now. So just to sort of warn you. The next person that ties into this is a gentleman called Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan is a politician in America, and he strongly believes that cultural Marxism is a thing. He's also an evolution denialist. I don't know whether that plays into it at all, but he is. Now, what his particular take on cultural Marxism is well, let's see if it becomes apparent. He wrote a book called The Death of the West: How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization. So what he's concerned about is immigrants invading his country, which will ultimately imperil his civilization. And he is a strong proponent of another theory that ties into cultural Marxism, which you may have heard of, which is called the Great Replacement Theory. Yeah. And the idea of the Great Replacement Theory is that either by using refugees from wars, often Muslims, or by using capitalistic means, by using workers, essentially, this is the multiculturalism aspect of cultural Marxism. Using immigration, it will flood countries and it will destroy their original culture. You'll just get this mishmash, this hodgepodge, and white people will become first a minority and then eventually they will disappear. And this was started by a gentleman called René Camus, and it's been taken to sort of different extremes. The one that people might be the most familiar with is called the Kalergi program. Now, the idea of the Kalergi program was that basically they would move people into the Western world in order to dilute the white race. In the future, it would be completely multicultural. And it's based on this quote, apparently from Kalergi's book. He says, "The man of the future will be of mixed race. The races and classes of today will gradually disappear due to the elimination of space, time, and prejudice. The Eurasian Negroid race of the future, similar in appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the current diversity of peoples and the diversity of individuals. Instead of destroying European Judaism, Europe, against her will, refined and educated this people, driving them to their future status as a leading nation through this artificial evolutionary process. It's not surprising that the people that escaped the ghetto prison became the spiritual nobility of Europe. Thus, the compassionate care given by Europe created a new breed of aristocrats. This happened when the European feudal aristocracy crashed because of the emancipation of the Jews." And to tie into this idea is this idea that the Coudenhove-Kalergi Pan-Europa Society hands out an award every year in order to celebrate people that are promoting multiculturalism. And the idea is that they were one of the chief driving forces behind the European Union and wanting to keep people in the European Union. That is the Kalergi plan. Oh dear, we're on to the two worst ones now. Critical race theory. Now, here's a lovely, a non-controversial topic. Now, critical race theory is not a new thing in regards to academia. It actually started in academia in 1989. But in recent times, it has become the most diversive thing, particularly in a certain swathe of American politics. Now, nobody had really heard of critical race theory outside of a very few people who'd studied it in university, except for this chap called Christopher Ruffo. Now, Christopher Ruffo just happens to be a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which was founded by Anthony Fisher of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the UK branch of the Heritage Foundation. Anyway, that's probably a coincidence. He claims that critical race theory is cultural Marxism, and that in the 60s, Marxists changed from class conflict to racial or ethnic conflict. So he goes down a similar line to what Jordan Peterson has said. He also cites Gramsci, saying that basically they needed to focus Marxism on cultural institutions rather than hope for the revolution to happen. And he does note that prominent racial activist Angela Davis actually had some classes with Herbert Marcuse. So what he says is, CRT is an academic discipline formulated in the 1960s and built on the intellectual framework of identity-based Marxism. Okay, ideas about racial equality are neo-Marxism. So again, this idea that the concept of race and racism as a bad thing didn't exist until these Marxist Jews invented it in the 1960s, apparently. And he says, in contrast to equality, equity, as defined and promoted by CRT, is little more than reformed Marxism. Now, just to explain what equity is, equity in critical race theory says that even though on the surface we have equality in society, because systems are inherently racist, there can be no true equality, and what we need to strive for is equity. And what equity is true equality that takes all these prejudices into account. And basically he says that these are the things that he hates about critical race theory. He says, critical race theory thinks that racism is systemic. He doesn't believe that. He says that race can drive belief and behaviors, that basically famous role models can be beneficial, and to not have famous role models makes you feel down. And he doesn't agree with that. He doesn't believe that white privilege is a thing, and he doesn't believe that the system is biased towards whites. He doesn't like the term white fragility, and he thinks that critical race theory is ultimately pro-black, anti-white racism, and he has actually got some evidence for this. The evidence is that when certain white people did critical race theory courses that talked to them about systemic and inherent racism, perhaps things that they had not thought about, it made the white people feel bad, and that is racism.
But that's not CRT, though, is it?
I mean, it is, kind of is, but like, you know, it's not really, maths makes me feel bad because I'm bad at it.
I don't personally feel responsible for slavery just because I'm white.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that when I hear bad news in the news in general, I suppose, I just feel bad.
Yeah.
You have feelings for stuff when you interact with it, when you absorb it. If it's not a nice topic, you might feel down about it.
But Christopher Ruffo thinks that this is a Marxist plot to make you, the white man, feel worse than you should. And ultimately, what that will do is it will just cause the complete collapse of everything that we love dear. And there'll be blacks and gays on every television channel all the time. It'll be chaos. This is genuinely what Christopher Ruffo thinks. He has got a quote to kind of support his theory. So, let's be fair. This is a quote from Ibram X. Kendi. In order to be anti-racist, you have to be anti-capitalist. And Marxism is about the overthrow of capitalism. QED. There you go. That's Christopher Ruffo's take on it. The trans agenda. A gentleman called Walt Heyer. Now, Walt Heyer is an interesting person. He was transitioned into a woman for 8 years, and then he transitioned back, claiming that it was a mistake. And he's very, very angry about this whole thing. And his thing is that basically he thinks that there's a degree of oversensitivity and to see everything as indicative of trans to the point where surgery is involved, to the point where anything that is seen as negative against trans people is almost sort of treated as criminal. But he also ties it back to cultural Marxism by basically using some quotes. He says, policing language is thought control, which is Marxism. So There you go. That's what he says. Now, he's not the only person that brings this up. Like Tammy Bruce, who's actually on Fox News, she said that the trans agenda is obscenely Marxist because it deconstructs what it means to be female. And there's deconstruction in Marxism, hence it's obviously a Marxist plot. Candace Owens said Harry Styles wearing a dress is part of a wider plan to demasculate the West and destroy its Christian values. Now, she's very obviously referring to cultural Marxism. Interestingly, she's black, so she's not taken that aspect of the cultural Marxist theory on board, but she doesn't like Harry Styles wearing a dress. What Hare said this: Marxism, with its guiding principle of abolish and destroy, goes a long way to explaining today's student transgender activism. The forces behind the gender agenda have utilized Marxist techniques of silencing dissent. And what he's referring to there is in Stalinist Russia, if basically you said anything against Stalin, you would be taken away and murdered and then sort of X'd from the history book. So what Voltaire is implying is that if you say anything against the trans agenda, you'll be taken away secretly in the night by death squads and murdered. He also says, transgenderism destroys the family and is consistent with Marxist soulless ideology, which is fundamentally incompatible with the Judean-Christian foundations of the nation. It brings class struggle from the economic into the cultural sphere by provoking clashes between ideas and people. What he's harking back to is this intellectual idea that's proposed by Jordan Peterson, that it's a new type of Marxism. It uses all the foundational theory of Marxism, but it shifts it from class to race. Therefore, there's a conflict in between them. That conflict will somehow cause the revolution, apparently. He also says that trans people and homosexuality is against God. And he also reminds us that Marx was evil and that Marx wanted to destroy God. He also harks back to the fact that Marx was Jewish. This is a Jewish plot of Jewish Marxists. The famous quote of Marx is that religion is the opium for the masses. He says religion is used by the bourgeoisie for the exploitation and the stupefaction of the working class. Now, we will come back to that, but basically that is seen sometimes as being very disrespectful, saying that basically only stupid people are interested in religion. It doesn't mean that, but we'll come back to that. That is why Heyer thinks that that's a perfect example of how Marxist theory is embedded into the transgender agenda. So that is the evidence for the theory of cultural Marxism, and there is quite a lot of it, or at the very least, it goes on for quite a long time. I don't know if there's quite a lot of evidence, but are you swayed? Do you think that there is a Marxist Jewish plot to undermine and destroy Western civilization by the introduction of black people, multiculturalism, progressive ideas about homosexuality and LGBT people, and remembering the evidence that there are black people and gay people on the television?
It's just a bunch of people who reckon stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just seen to be a bunch of people that reckon stuff, yes, on the face of it. It's not the strongest evidence, to be fair. It's almost like, and I'm not saying it's definitely this, but it's definitely this. It's almost like they've taken some stuff that they don't like, and rather than saying, I don't like this, because people will say, well, why don't you like that? And they haven't got a good answer. They want to tie it to something that is horrific, like Stalinism. So it's not that I'm racist, right? Okay. It's not that I don't like immigrants because, frankly, brown people scare me, right? I'm a patriot. I'm fighting against a hidden Marxist, commie, Nazi plot to undermine Western Judeo-Christian values.
People, I'm the good guy, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the thing about a lot of theories. I mean, even hardcore Nazis think that they're the good guys, right? Nobody goes into a group like thinking that the bad guys. People who are in race hate groups, they think that they have a good reason to hate that race. They think like this, that the Jews or the blacks or the Mexicans or whatever are undermining society. They think that, at the very least, they think that what they're doing is they're diluting the stuff that they like. It's like, bloody hell, we can't have a Morris dance because Pedros here. And like, you know, that's literally the sort of the thought. So yes, on the surface, it doesn't seem like a terribly strong theory. We're going to rebut all of the actual evidence. We're going to go over each thing and sort of test it. Before we do that, we need to do essentially what's a bit of house clearing. This isn't Marxism. Let's take it as read, right? Okay, that there's a plot to sort of embed people in culture and change the culture. That's not Marxism. Marx never ever spoke about culture. In fact, in Marxism, the relation between the society and the culture is symbiotic, in as much as you have what's called the base. The base is everything that's concerned with the means of production. So that's your people, your factories, your road infrastructure, everything to do with work and to do with moving the country on. And then feeding into that, or over the top of that, you have what's called the superstructure. Now, the superstructure is everything that's not concerned with the means of production. So that's the arts, the education, the law systems, and what could be determined as the culture. But this is all underpinned by what Marx determined as ideology. Now, what that means is that nothing that goes into culture in Marxism is concerned with anything other than Marxism. So there's no such thing as a counterculture. There's no such thing as a culture that goes against the dominant ideology. That's why if you look at Marxist paintings, they're all concerned with ladies in fields and tractors and machines, because the only culture that they're interested in is the proliferation of Marxism as an ideology. The superstructure is determined by the base within the boundaries of Marxist ideology, and nothing goes outside of this ideology. The other thing is that Marxism doesn't think of things in terms of what could happen. One of the fundamental underpinnings of Marxism is a thing called dialectical materialism. Dialectical simply means how we get our understanding of the world, and materialism means with the real world. And Marx felt that dialectical materialism is the only way that you can convince people to do things, only with reality. You can't do it with the abstract ideas. It needs to be something that pertains to, essentially, again, the means of production. Marx was desperately obsessed with the means of production. It was almost like the thing that he was most concerned with. And so the concept of cultural Marxism doesn't actually work within the concept of Marxism as a thing. So calling it cultural Marxism, it fails on a foundational basis because it's literally nothing to do with Marxist society. Now, further to that, Marx was absolutely not concerned with the individual. So all this idea of like the concept of individual Marxism, the idea of promoting LGBT causes or black people or individual causes or anything like that would be completely alien to Marx, because Marx didn't care about the individual. He says the individual is unimportant. Society will go its own way. Now, the Gramsci quote is failed because we need to get into the culture. We need to go into the institutions. You know what? Gramsci was correct. He was absolutely correct. That was a failure of Marxism. And if you wanted to change society, you would need to propose a new form of society in institutions. The problem is that isn't Marxism. It just isn't Marxism. It's Hegelianism. It's this Hegelian dialectic that people talk about, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So with Gramsci, what he was saying was essentially, this capitalism's a bit crap. Can we compromise? They'd say no. He'd push back, and we'd end up with socialism, which is in the middle, or we'd end up with some sort of compromise, which is the synthesis. Now, that isn't Marxism. So should it be called cultural Hegelianism? No, it shouldn't, because, well, there's several problems with it. One, nobody listened to Gramsci. Gramsci and Georgi Lukács had nothing to do with each other. Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse had nothing to do with one another. They just happened to be Marxists in completely different countries that had completely different ideas. There was no uniform school of thought from the Frankfurt School. This idea that Frankfurt School ideology was like a sort of uniform thing is just nonsense. Wilhelm Reich stuff is completely different to Theodore Adorno stuff. And Walter Benjamin's stuff is completely different to Erich Fromm's stuff. It's a multi-discipline, multi-thetical sort of ideas school, where the only theories that were coming out of it was that all three things were tyrannical. All of them are totalitarian. Marxism, when it gets to the stage of Stalinism, is totalitarian. Why would they want to spread an idea that they believe is A, totalitarian, and B, has failed? What they also felt was that fascism was totalitarian and that capitalism was also totalitarian because it basically dictates what your choices are. It gives you the impression of having choice, but it really doesn't. Now, the other thing is that Marx himself was a misogynistic, racist anti-Semite. A lot of people think that Marx was Jewish. He was actually Christian, but didn't really practice religion. And he really, really hated the Jews. He just properly hated the Jews. So the idea that there'd be this sort of Marxist Jewish cultural plot focusing on the individual with tactics that are completely antithetical to Marxist theory, it falls at the first hurdle, I'm afraid.
I know myself. He is bloodline Jewish. It wasn't his grandmother
Jewish, I believe.
Yeah, but his father converted, didn't he, to Christianity?
Yeah, and Marx himself was particularly not a fan of religion. Now, the religion is the opium of the masses. It's a stupefaction of the proletariat. That's been misinterpreted because at the time, opium was a medicine.
Yeah.
So he's not using it in the concept of like, oh, these religious people are smackheads. He's saying that basically it gives comfort and aid to the masses. Yeah. And in many ways, he's evoking what Gramsci said, that basically if people have got some outlet, something that they can turn to, they're going to be more satisfied in their life. They're going to be less likely to want to overthrow the bourgeoisie with a violent proletariat revolution. The most sort of like telling thing is that the first use of the phrase cultural Marxism came from Georgy Lukács himself. If you remember, Lind and Weyrich said that Lukács was behind the theory. When he used the phrase cultural Marxism, he was criticizing the Frankfurt School for being posers. He says, you're cultural Marxists, you're posers, you're Marxists in name only, you're not proper Marxists. So that's one of these most ridiculous things, is that the theory itself is based on a criticism of the school not being Marxist enough.
So a Marxist comes up with the term to slag off other Marxists that he thought were just posers.
Yes.
So it's like a purity testing kind of slur.
Not when flat earthers turn on each other.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, he did think that they would find the answer to Marxism. Why can't we get it to work? And they did. They found the answer to it. It's because it's totalitarian, because it's nonsense, because it doesn't work. We like some of the principles of it, but the system doesn't work. And you know what's really insulting about cultural Marxism as a theory, as pushed by Mendecino and Lind and Jordan Peterson and Andrew Breitbart, is it relies on people not reading the books that come out of the Frankfurt School. Because, you know, in the Frankfurt School books, there's literally those two quotes. That's their evidence. These mountains, you can research it for your entire life. These mountains of different theories that come out of there. And it relies on people not reading the sources and just assuming that, oh, Jordan Peterson's probably got it right. Oh, Paul Weyrich has probably got it right. And I'll give you an example, right, of how not only do people not read the Frankfurt School stuff, but if they did, they would agree with it. There's three things. One is called the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And basically, this was a criticism of capitalism from Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer. And as I said, they were critical of fascism, capitalism, and Soviet Russia. And they felt that all three were repressive and controlling. Now, the fundamental premise of the Dialectic of Enlightenment is that pure logic and science becomes inhuman. Myth is enlightenment, and enlightenment is myth. So the best way to explain this is what they'd observed in Nazi Germany was they'd gone from the mythic idea, this idea of, say, Parsifal and the Holy Grail and like the Spear of Destiny and Teutonic Knights and all these myths and ideas, to becoming the most cold, rational, mechanized killing machine based on the pure science of eugenics and based on the pure science of efficiency. So it was that pure science that had led to the Holocaust, say, and the Eichmann principles of basically work them until their death, get the maximum out of these people, treat them as cattle as opposed to humans. And so by instituting that pure rationality, that science goes to the point where science strips people of their humanity. In order to justify that, it goes back to the mythic. Nazis have gone from Teutonic Knights to eugenics, and that eugenics and the Nazi killing machine is justified by the myth of the Aryan Superman. And the same thing happened in Soviet Russia. It's gone from the myth of this utopia to this ultimate mechanization, to the Holodomor, to the idea of Stalin as a god. So what they're saying is that they've observed that societies build themselves up by celebrating myth. So the celebration of reason by the thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment, which was a move away from mythicism, led to the development of technologically sophisticated but oppressive and inhumane modes of governance, exemplified by fascism and totalitarianism. And the best way that this was ever explained to me was a short story, very, very short. I think it's by a bloke called Romanishon, but I can't find it anywhere, but I can remember it. He says, I got into a spaceship and I looked and all the panels lit up and it was fabulous. There was a whirring and the engines came on and the rocket boosters went up and my display screens came on and I was lifted off the ground with a terrific force. And all of a sudden I could see everything. I could see the entire world. And I thought, this is fabulous. This is marvelous. I've done something that nobody has ever done before. And then it suddenly struck me, how do I get back? And that's the problem that they discovered, is that basically once you start to sort of believe in anything, be that myth or rationality to any degree, it gets to the point where basically it becomes inhumane and it ignores the individual and it ignores rationality. The second thing that they said was that culture is ruined by capitalism. And this is an argument called the culture industry. And what they said is that basically capitalism removes all the art from artistry and it mechanizes it. It turns it into a factory. And the best example of this, which I'm sure you all agree with, is the X Factor. Least amount of money in, most profit out, factory line, people who are manufactured to the whim of the audience that they know is going to sell, that they know is going to be profitable, doing covers. There's no art in that. There's no artistry. That's capitalism, pure, raw capitalism. And it's the same with all these films that they knock out, that they know are going to be crap, but they know they're going to make millions of dollars, and then they can sell it to China. And so essentially, that's the concept of the culture industry. And this is something that we see very prevalent in society today. Now, the third thing that they talked about was the idea of the authoritarian personality and the idea that these people could, in essence, become the sort of the sods in totalitarian societies. And basically, there are traits of a fascist. An authoritarian personality is a personality characterized by strict adherence to highly simplified conventional values, an attitude of great deference to authority figures, whilst demanding subservience from those regarded as low in status, and hostility towards people who deviate from the convention. And he says that conventionalism, submission to authority, aggression to people below you, a dislike of subjectivity and imagination, superstition and wanting to stereotype people, wanting to be and being impressed by power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, projection, and an exaggerated concern about sex. All of those things are indicative of the authoritarian personality that might be driven towards fascism. The more of those things that you tick those boxes for, the more likely you are to be fascist. So this is where we start to see where people like, say, Paul Weyrich and Michael Mendecino might be annoyed with those characterizations, because essentially they fall under all of those things. They have got the authoritarian thing. In fact, the very concept of cultural Marxism is that those things are being challenged. You can see why they would actually be averse to those kinds of ideas. I mean, it actually gets a bit worse than that. The best example, of which we can sort of say straight away, is if you can remember in the New Dark Age, essentially he was annoyed about our children spend as much time sitting in front of the TV sets as they do in front of school, blah, blah, blah. And he said that basically the violence that's put through the television media and stuff like that, this is a Marxist plot. That's not Marxism. That's a consequence of capitalism. That's capitalism in its rawest form again. Basically, what they're saying there is that there's new markets out there. Why is violence on the television? I'll tell you why violence is on the television. Because people want to watch violence.
It sells.
Right? Yeah. Why are there women on television? Because that's a market that they want to appeal to. Here's your aspirational heroes so that you can be a bit like them. So that's what's strange about a lot of these criticisms, is that they're actually criticisms of society. So let's go over to what Michael Mendecino actually said. He said that the use of modern art, the use of polling, brainwashing, advertising techniques to manipulate the public and politics, this creates alienation. That's capitalism. That's not Marxism at all. Marxism does not seek to alienate people. Marxism, by its very definition, is communal. That's why it's called communism.
Yeah.
So when he's basically saying our plastic arts are ugly, our architecture is ugly, our clothes are ugly, music does not uplift or tranquilize, it claws at our ears, sometimes spitting out an obscenity. That's not a consequence of Marxism. That's a consequence of capitalism. So the things that in Michael Mendecino's new dark age, the Frankfurt School, they fall under two categories. One, not being true, or two, actually not being Marxism at all, but actually being a criticism of capitalism. Now, you remember he made the thing about university lecturers being cancelled and stuff like that. Now, it would be naive to say that this never happens, but it's not as pervasive or as uniform as people would have. Are there examples? Yeah, of course there are examples. In the example that he uses, which came out in 1992, he talks about Chaucer being cancelled. I did a bit of a Google. Chaucer's been cancelled every year since the internet existed by the looks of it, and yet he's still going. So this idea of cancel culture in university, that's not what I saw when I went to university, right? Okay, and admittedly it was a while ago, but there's certain fundamental contradictions about that. You pay for university. University is, again, it's a capitalistic venture. What if you don't do sociology? So you never look at critical theory, or you're not doing psychology. What if you're doing economics? You might look at Marxist theory to a degree, but then you decide that it's not very profitable. So you won't go down that. What if you're doing a business degree? Like, what if you're doing a language degree or engineering? None of these things are infiltrated by Marxist thought or by critical theory. Now, it goes further than that, because Michael Mendecino, he actually denounced his ideas. He completely denounced his ideas. Can you remember the quote that he said about the Frankfurt School was an incredible assortment of not only communists, but also non-party socialists, radical phenomenologists, Zionists, renegade Freudians, and at least a few members of the Court of a Star. At the time, he was working for a think tank which connected to this movement called the Lind and LaRouche movement. Now, the Lind and LaRouche movement was famously anti-Semitic, and the Schiller Institute, which was financed by the Lind and LaRouche movement, if you remember, its overarching principle was that there was this hidden group of people, international bankers, and they're responsible for all the ills in the world, which is a very, very obvious dog whistle towards the grand Jewish conspiracy. He completely denounced his entire theory. He called it crack-brained, and he said that the only reason that he'd done it was to impress Lind and LaRouche, who was a massive anti-Semite, and so he wanted to make up a plausible theory in order to basically impress his boss. So the first person to promulgate this theory admits that it was bullshit. I mean, there are certain things in it that he gets wrong. Like when he said the purpose of modern art, literature, and music must be to destroy the uplifting, therefore bourgeois potential of art. He's got that totally wrong. It's now been admitted, and I hate to get into wooey areas, but it's now been admitted that actually, particularly in America, modern art was pushed by, not Marxists, by the CIA. And the reason that modern art was actually pushed and popularized was because there's no political message in it. It's just fluff, essentially. Although it has got artistic merit, it's not going to cause a revolution. So the very idea that Marxists were doing this to cause a revolution is not borne out by the facts that the CIA were actually doing it to stop a revolution. So he's completely wrong with that. So his criticisms of technology and authority basically are mirrored by the Frankfurt School. What he was saying about how they were behind the creation of TV and film and media. A, no, they weren't. B, the culture industry is completely critical of all of those things. So he actually agrees with them. Like, for example, advertising is product of capitalism. And all the political correctness stuff, there is not a single thing in any of the Frankfurt School material anywhere that mentions political correctness. It's all just made up rubbish. Now, there is a reason that Michael Mendecino publicly denounced it. Now, he did claim that he'd long thought it was rubbish, but there might have been another reason that he was publicising this. Michael Mendecino was quoted many times by Anders Breivik. Anders Breivik, as you may remember, was the man that shot all those children in Norway.
Yeah.
He very much believed in the cultural Marxist theory. In fact, that was one of his main reasons for doing that shooting. And in that, he praises Michael Mendecino. And so Michael Mendecino was very keen to get his name disassociated with Anders Breivik. Do you know who else Anders Breivik praised in his manifesto?
Times journalist?
Jeremy Clarkson and the Top Gear program.
Oh.
An example of resisting cultural Marxism.
I watched that film recently, and I do remember it happening at the time, but I think I was abroad when it, so I didn't see all the coverage. And it's just such an unexpected event for somewhere like Norway, isn't it?
Yeah.
For me, I mean, maybe I'm not being naive to an extent. Maybe if you live in Norway, you're more aware of these sorts of dangers. But you don't think of Norway as somewhere that's going to have that happen. That was harrowing. It's quite a hard watch, really. I don't think I even watched all of the film. I was always interested by the thumbnail on Netflix, but I thought, right, I've got to be in the mood for that kind of dark content.
I've got a sneaking suspicion that the Christchurch shooter also mentioned cultural Marxism.
He did. And as I was saying, the Times journalist is Melanie Phillips.
Who's she? Who's Melanie Phillips? Why am I not familiar with her?
Times, Guardian, Spectator, Daily Mail.
Oh, Spectator. Okay, fair enough.
Author of Londonistan.
Oh, she's one of those, right?
Yeah.
So she's another sort of like journalist that sort of pays heed to or dog whistles to the ideas of cultural Marxism, implying that basically I don't just not like immigrants. There's actually a more sinister plot going on, basically. Now, interesting, the Spectator is owned by the Barclay brothers, and again, they're all involved in this kind of nexus. You'll notice that all of these ideas, it's a right-wing theory. So you'll notice again these various sort of strengths of this theory that are delineated through. It was used in Brexit, the concept of cultural Marxism. I say it's been brought up in the Houses of Commons. You've got some people like Andrew Breitbart who will say certain things. Jordan Peterson will dance around it. And then you'll have some people like Farage and Marianne Le Pen, proper far-right people who basically are unapologetic about its use. It was the second one that caused the most publicity, The Roots of Political Correctness with Paul Weyrich and William Lind. This is where they kind of brought into this idea that, it is true, there's certain things that you can't say nowadays that you used to be able to say. And it happens so very, very quick. It's kind of strange. I saw a meme the other day basically saying, everything's gone mad in the last 40 years, blah, blah, blah. And it's like 40 years? Can you imagine somebody in the 90s using the values of the 1950s? But that's how long ago it is. Well, it's 30 years for the 90s, but it's a long time. Attitudes change. Language changes. What becomes acceptable doesn't become acceptable. And part of it is to do with something called euphemism creep. Terms like idiot and imbecile, they've got horrible connotations. Idiot essentially means brain damaged. And what happens is the problem is, for example, now, special is an insult, because special was the term that was used for mentally handicapped people. The problem is twofold. One, people like to insult other people. Two, there's euphemism creep, which means that basically it will become offensive due to the connotations of how it's used. The word itself wasn't offensive. Now it's offensive because of the way that people use it. And this is just more to do with the evolution of language and the evolution of society.
more connected we are and the more integrated we are. Like, I don't think it's any coincidence that people that are more anti-immigration have met less immigrants or have seen the positive impacts of immigration less.
Yes.
I had a friend he was mixed race. He was half Danish, half Ethiopian. He grew up in Denmark. I think he was adopted by an Ethiopian mum. And to them, he was black, and there's not as many black people in Scandinavia as there is in England, for example.
Yeah.
And in Ethiopia, he felt white. Like, children would follow him in the streets because they were fascinated by the white man. To them, he was white. The only place he felt it didn't even occur to anyone was London. I grew up in Brighton, but I lived in London, and I understand how they grew up to an extent. Yeah, generally London's so much, and Brighton's very similar. Brighton's less so than London, as much as everyone likes to think, as much as Brightonians like to think of Brighton as the most progressive, liberal place on earth. It's fucking not. It can be so far. There is still a lot of multiculturalism here compared to, say, Plymouth, or Burnley, or Skegness. I could go on shit countries.
Well, the thing is, right, once people get a tiny bit of power, they get a voice, they get a platform, and they get some response, then sometimes it goes to their head. So they get a little dopamine hit, like, I stuck up for the black guy, and everyone thinks I'm a hero. Now that's going to be my raison d'etre. And the problem is that basically the more media outlets that you've got, and there's more opinions to disagree with you. And yes, of course, there are examples of people going far too far with that and almost looking to get outraged. But that outrage exists on both sides of the political spectrum as well. It wasn't the left wing that cancelled Colin Kaepernick for protesting against police violence. It wasn't the left that cancelled Doctor Who for daring to have a woman on it. It wasn't the left that cancelled James Bond for daring to suggest that a black actor might take the role. It wasn't the left that cancelled the Dixie Chicks for suggesting that there was something dodgy about going to war with Iraq. It wasn't the left that decided to call French fries freedom fries because the French nation didn't want to get involved in the war. So this concept of cancel culture, again, it's just a thing that's always existed. This idea that it's politically motivated one side or the other, it just isn't true. Now, to go back to his quote of saying you can't approach the truth about a lot of subjects. If you do, you will be branded as racist, sexist, homophobic, insensitive, or judgmental. Well, make your argument. If you're not trying to do that, then explain that. Like, say if you get called out for something that you did 20 years ago, right? Okay, on Twitter, you've got two choices. You either say, oh, damn, yeah, that does look very old-fashioned nowadays. I've grown as a person, and I'm sorry for saying that. That was a stupid thing for me to say. Or you go, I still think that. And if you still think that, why do you care what anybody else thinks?
Yeah, obviously attitudes change and people and society progresses, and we should embrace that as we get older. But it's in the creative space that I see it quite a lot. Just you get these comedians pulled out for something they said or did 20 years ago, and it's just like, you can't judge someone for something they did in their 20s.
No, there needs to be context and context of the time period as well. David Dill gets that quite a lot. You blacked up and dressed as Jason Lee, that's appalling. It's like, well, no, at the time, nobody batted an eye. Now, maybe, again, that was because nobody had the platform to bat an eye. But you've got to judge it on the time that it took place, basically.
But
so
like
totally
you said, you have to say sorry or double down.
Exactly.
And the best thing really to do is say sorry.
What you can't do is get mardy because society's moved on.
Yeah.
You can't say, I want it to be 1990 again. Well, you can, but you're on a hiding to nowhere.
Yeah.
And just to go back to the quote, like basically, you will be branded as racist, sexist, homophobic, insensitive, or judgmental. Whilst I totally agree with you, and we could all think of examples where people have gone too far, the problem is that Paul Weyrich and William Lind, who we're talking about in this particular instance, they were racist, they were homophobic, they were xenophobic. Paul Weyrich, I mean, he was friends with actual Nazis, like proper, actual card-carrying Nazis. He's made many homophobic statements. William Lind asked for the return of hanging in urban areas. Nowhere else, just in urban areas. Like, they're well known in far-right circles, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean that as in these people were genuinely nasty far-right people. And if you remember what the main point of the culture war letter and what the culture war in itself, remember what the point of that is to go, we're not playing, I'm taking my ball home. So what they've done is they've said, we like racism. We think you should be allowed to be racist and sexist and homophobic. And so we're going to do that. And if people say you're not allowed to do that, then we're going to create it and make it into a cultural thing and take our ball away and go, oh, we're not going on Twitter then, we're going on Gab, we're going on Parler, we're going on Telegram. And they're framing it like, oh, we're being persecuted. We're being persecuted for our beliefs. They're almost making it sort of quasi-religious. Like, oh, it's the same as being told that I can't wear a headscarf. No, it's not. Being told that you can't call somebody P word or an F word or an N word on Twitter is not the same as somebody denigrating your religion and stopping you from practicing your religion. But that was entirely the whole point of the culture war. This is the thing. They're telling you in their own literature, this is bullshit, this is nonsense, but it's a very effective nonsense that we can use. We can use some genuine issues, some things that people find annoying and niggling and that don't work about society because society is so very complicated. And we will exaggerate that, make it out that this is everywhere, that it's completely pervasive, and then we're going to double down on that by saying it's a plot. And so basically this is the justification. I'm not racist, okay, and I've just got these views, and it's totalitarian for you to shut me down. And that's projection, because it's not. They're trying to persecute somebody. They're trying to make somebody a lesser person. And so for you to try and stop them doing that, that's not persecution. That's protection of another person. Can that go too far? Yeah, of course it can. You get people outraged for no reason, and people who jump on bandwagons, and people who use it to portray themselves as a much nicer person that they are, and really all they want is power, and they've just got power in a different flavour. The problem is that the people who are codifying this theory and codifying the understanding of what is to be contained in this theory are actually card-carrying racists. So if you remember, they said that basically that the proof of this plot was blacks and gay people being on television, which was supported by the Marcuse quote, a coalition of black students, feminists and homosexuals could be a feasible vanguard for the Cultural Revolution. I mean, I think we all picked up that that was nonsense at the beginning. Of course, those are going to be the vanguard for revolution. You don't go to the aristocracy and go, do you fancy a No, you're doing all right. Okay, fine. No, you don't know revolution then? No. All right, well, I'll have to go to the oppressed people.
Absolutely.
You know, the people who are loving it, they don't tend to want the status quo, don't tend to want the status quo to change. So who are you going to go to as a vanguard of change in society?
And that quote says that those people exist, right?
Yeah.
But the quote is used as if they're creating these people.
Well, A, that they're creating these people, or B, that this was actually an organised plot. I mean, this is the point. That is literally it. This quote basically saying, oh yeah, these people who are proponents of the theory just so happen to not like, just on a fundamental level, because they are black, feminist, gay, whatever, they don't like them. And he's suggesting that these people could be in some way useful. Well, that's a way to double demonize it. It is. Again, it's like I said, they're taking something they don't like, black people, gay people. They're taking something that people don't understand and are afraid of because they only have the basic understanding, which is Marxism, and saying black people and gay people are Marxist based on the most thin, ridiculous, non-connective quote.
A quote that recognizes that these people are marginalized and that they would probably, like our ideas.
Yeah,
that's all it is saying.
Used to garner support for, and then accused of being a plot.
Yeah.
I can't even remember where I saw it being spoken about, but like political strategies winning elections. And basically, Trump was the master of this. He went to every individual state, found out for his team, presumably, because he ain't going to research it himself, what the people of Michigan, for example, were hurting over. And specifically, the example with Michigan was that General Motors was going to move their manufacturing out of Michigan and thus making 7,000 people unemployed or something like that. So he went on to put a tax levy on their imports to the United States, making it irrelevant, basically. So they were like, yeah, Donald Trump's saving what we need specifically, and went with it. And once political formulas found out the way, that's what they do. They made Brexit all about immigration, then did fuck all about to change immigration once Brexit was done. All right, okay, I suppose now there's a few things have trickled down. They're just doubling down on what they already thought and already wanted to do, really. All we've done with the immigration as a result of Brexit is completely decimated the hospitality industry, frankly, because there's big sectors that are missing a workforce now, not just hospitality, of course. But yeah, basically, the support for Brexit was garnered off the back of what they felt that they needed to pitch in order to... I really want to know why there are certain people that were so interested in getting it done. I know perfectly intelligent people that voted leave, sure. I didn't even vote for this because I realised I wasn't qualified in the topic. But
well, if you want to know exactly what happened, you need to go to my website, neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and listen to my perfectly free 10-hour-long Cambridge Analytica podcast, which will explain exactly how they micro-targeted people, which is what you're talking about, going to people and finding out exactly what's upsetting them, and then telling them that that is what you're going to do. The same thing happened with Brexit. They found out by stealing people's data what they were angry about, what they didn't like, and then they told them that if we leave the EU, all that will stop. The interesting connection between this, Paul Weyrich, who started the Heritage Foundation, the John Birch Society, Council of National Policy, and Andrew Breitbart, Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon, who are also in the Council of National Policy and the Heritage Foundation, they were behind the mechanism that was used to do that micro-targeting, which is the mind control program, Cambridge Analytica. So it's the same kind of people manipulating society or trying to manipulate society with the same fear-based tactics. What is it you don't like? Well, that's connected to this other thing that we don't like. What is it you don't like? Immigrants? That's connected to the EU. What is it you don't like? Immigrants or your factory going, that's connected to Hillary Clinton. With this, it's what is it you don't like? Well, gay people slightly concern me. Oh, they're communists. Like, you know what it keeps coming back to the whole thing. I'm always reminded of the Buford T. Justice quote from Smokey and the Bandit. She insulted my town, she insulted my son, she insulted my authority, and that's nothing but pure and simple old-fashioned communism. And like, there's as much sense in that as there is in the cultural Marxism thing. See that thing that I don't like, it's another thing that I don't like. Hence, it's a conglomeration of all the worst things in the world. It's like Ed Sheeran and Coldplay doing a collaboration. Like, it's terrible. But that's it. That's the simplistic nature of it. It gets slightly worse than that. The Frankfurt School conspiracy to corrupt. Remember the Timothy Mattthews thing that basically said that homosexuality and creating of racism offences and stuff was the satanic part of the... Oh, yeah. Remember how I offered you no evidence for that? But that's because he offers no evidence for that. He literally just says it. He just says it and repeats it.
Does he not just use his theology or anything?
Not really, no. Again, it's all the same tropes. Marx is evil. Marx is anti-God. This is an anti-religious thing. He simply relies on the tropes. He adds nothing new to the theory. Well, sorry, he adds the added spice of Satan. So, you know...
They also have a little side hustle that's pedo hunting or outing paedophiles in some way, shape or form. They've always got to tie that into the brand. It's like they've got a marketing team backstage that's just like, and say something bad about nonsense. That'll get people on side.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you why that is. It's because it's very difficult to argue against it. One of the things that I've noticed is a lot of these paedophile hunters are ex-football hooligans. They're connected to far-right groups. They're generally not very nice people. And it's one of two things. They're either looking to desperately rehabilitate their personality, or that's the in. Because once you've been hanging around with these people, and we agree on this one thing, that basically, paedophiles are bad, that's the first principle of sales. Get them to say yes, get them to say yes. And then when you say, you really like this product, don't you? Get them to say yes. And so when you say, basically, it's not just the paedophiles, right? It's the gays and blacks. And that feeds into the paedophiles, right? Okay. And that's a Marxist plot. Okay. So I'm not a bad guy. I know that society's painting me. I know it's cancel culture. I know this crazy wokeism is painting me as the bad guy. But I'm not the bad guy. I'm the only one that can see this insidious plot. I'm literally Rowdy Roddy Piper with the glasses on. And you crazy fools in your woke totalitarianism, insisting on being nice to people and not kicking someone to death for coming from Bangladesh. It's political correctness gone mad, I tell you. I know I'm being stupid, but that is literally the argument. Okay, so... Did Adorno write the Beatles music? Well,
Yes.
again, yeah, actually, that one is true. It turns out that he did write all the Beatles.
No, we're clearing up conspiracy theories here.
He hated the Beatles. He hated jazz. He was into 12-note atonal music, which I've tried to find out what it is. And it's like nothing like pop music. It was hilarious, actually. Somebody just out of the blue the other day posted on my Facebook the 20 best songs ever written by Theodore Adorno. And they had all sorts, like Rolling Stones ones on there, and like Jerry and the Pacemakers he wrote. Basically, he was responsible, this German-American Jewish Marxist old man, for literally everything with the British explosion of the 60s. He was like, and the evidence is, well, let's be fair, it's scant, shall we say, as in scant as in it doesn't exist. John Coleman literally said it in the book, The Committee of 300, and it gets repeated by so many people. And they go, well, yeah, but kind of, because pop culture and the invention of the teenager and Tavistock and blah, 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 that seems plausible. It's like, it doesn't matter if it seems plausible. It's about whether you can prove it or not, or you don't even have to prove it. But just some evidence would be nice, rather than just the say-so of somebody who wrote a book.
Plausible deniability. People stay away from, as soon as they hear something, confirmation bias comes into it as well. As soon as it's like flat earthers when they use evidence as something that they don't even know it's evidence themselves. They haven't verified it, haven't actually even tried to understand the studies and then put forth that opinion. They just repeated something that Eric Dubay might say or someone else.
Well, that's exactly it. And that's kind of the point of this program, is because basically there's a lot of these, they become tropes and truisms. Like, basically, the amount of times that you get into a conversation about somebody and it's right, okay, where's my preconceived answers? Like, you're talking about, I don't know, 9/11. You're going to bring out your thermite, you're going to bring out your explosions, you're going to bring out your transactions done right to the last minute, you're going to bring out your bloke still alive or whatever. And the problem
passports, just like Larry Silverman, whatever. The problem is that they become like pieces on a chessboard. Rather than you going, okay, that's interesting, let's look at it, or discussing in a civil matter why that's incorrect or why you never thought of it like that, they're just pieces now. They're just... See my Arizona Wilder confession. Poof. Like, oh, I see your Arizona Wilder confession, and she retracted it. Like, or whatever. But this is the problem. And again, I think this is exacerbated by social media, in as much as basically everything's very immediate now. Everyone's got to have opinion. Everyone's got to be right. The nuance goes out the window. 9 times out of 10, you don't really want to have that conversation. It's just piqued your annoyance. And you're just like, I just want to just own that person and then walk away. And those are the ones that you spend 3 days locked into Twitter. No one ever changes their mind on social media, like directly. I mean, I read something about how, you might not be changing the person's mind, you're actually arguing with other people. Sort of, I spectate on comment sections to learn about interaction. The more you learn about other people that are nothing like you, the more you learn stuff. Like the more people expect someone to hear lots of random information and within an instant get it, or the person tries to take that information within an instant, argue back and refute it. And it's just like, I've had people throw information at me and they're like, what do you think of that? And I'm like, well, that's all brand new. You can't expect it. I'm not so arrogant that I think I'm so smart that I can just take all that in with everything completely fresh within an instant, turn it back into a conclusive opinion that I've formed, like at the speed of light. Like, what do you think I am? And that's just social media. Everyone's so you can rally people against a cause they don't even agree with at first, and make it seem like it's an even bigger deal. Like Jordan Peterson, actually, he's a good example of what you were saying about 5 minutes ago, with when you've already got people on board with certain parts of a sale, as it were, then they'll buy the rest of it. So my first introduction to Jordan Peterson is actually through motivational videos. Yeah, which is excellent. Yeah, and how succeeded business videos. Not quite alongside, but within the same algorithm on YouTube as people like Gary Vaynerchuk, who, he's someone to really listen to, and, his attitude towards business and self-growth and stuff is perfectly valid and very tried and tested. It's not, I don't think they've actually shared the same screen, but it's in the same algorithm. So I've seen Jordan Peterson, and when you're into the world, when your algorithm is giving you positive, I just try and give myself positive content first thing in the morning. It's part of my routine.
And when you've already been sold on him for 3 or 4 months, I never saw that much of him, but I was starting to see him quite a bit over the last sort of few month period. But you've been sold quite a lot on someone like him for things you're already into. He's helping you in a department you're interested in anyway. He's improving you as a person. When he then later drops in something else, you're going to buy it, aren't you?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because he's become a trusted figure of authority. But that's kind of the grift. I mean, we'll come on to him in a second. That's the sad thing about Jordan Peterson. I think he knows exactly what he's doing with this particular one. He's just seen an opportunity for a market. But so just before we come on to Jordan Peterson, we've got Andrew Breitbart. Now, if you remember, he said that cultural Marxism was financed by George Soros, and FDR, Woodrow Wilson were part of the plot to undermine the US Constitution. And this was all going to be put through the universities by Saul Alinsky with his plot, 12 Rules for Radicals. Okay, we'll just start off the bat. FDR and Woodrow Wilson just so happened to be two presidents that were favoured by black people and Jewish people. I don't know whether that's got anything to do with Andrew Breitbart's particular picking on those two, but we'll never know. Does George Soros finance cultural Marxism? Well, bearing in mind that cultural Marxism is demonstrably not a real thing, it's probably not true that he's financing it. In fact, the interesting thing is that the entire canard against Soros was actually admittedly made up by two Jewish lawyers called Arthur Birnbaum and Abe Finkelstein. And they worked for Netanyahu, and as a favour to him, they devised an election campaign to get Viktor Orban in. They've all admitted this. Basically, what they did was they demonized Soros. They used him as the old Jewish puppet master. It's the NWO, Illuminati, Jewish plot, Jewish conspiracy. They literally just used that in order to paint him as the demon and to associate anybody that's next to him as bad. They admitted that they made the entire thing up. It's one of these crazy things where basically you ask about, well, what has George Soros actually done? He put money into progressive things like Black Lives Matter and Arts Council stuff and things to do with students. It's like, none of that's a bad thing.
Progressive as a society, fucking demon. Yeah. That's where we're at. That's where we're brilliant.
Right, isn't it? It's ridiculous. Now, Saul Alinsky, does 12 Rules for Radicals, does it introduce cultural Marxism to the masses, and does it act as a lesson plan in order to disseminate cultural masses? No, it doesn't. 12 Rules for Radicals actually criticizes Marxists, right? What 12 Rules for Radicals is about, it's about community action. Saul Alinsky said, right, okay, you need something done in your community. You cause a fuss and almost embarrass the people into having to listen to you. There was actually lots of different techniques that he used, and he criticized Marxists because he said, look, if you've got an ideology, you can't shift from your ideology. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a socialist. I'm a radical. I'll do whatever I need to do to get done what needs to be done. It's nothing to do with political correctness. It's nothing to do with anti-racism other than he was actually helping poor black people in Chicago get things like soup kitchens set up and facilities for black communities. Do you want to know why Saul Alinsky was smeared as a Marxist, cultural Marxist by Andrew Breitbart? It's literally because Obama and Hillary Clinton both praised Saul Alinsky. It's as simple as that. It's literally that. And again, this is insulting, right? Andrew Breitbart, a lot of people go, he's brilliant. He was. No, he thinks you're so stupid that he will lie to your face and know that you won't go and read the book to find out that he's lied to your face for money. That's how much he cares about you, right? He thinks you're stupid. He thinks you're an easy rube, a mark that he can manipulate for his own devious wants. So, yeah, he lied. Andrew Breitbart just flat out lied. And that's going to be a theme for the next one. Jordan Peterson, C16, that was the bill where he said that you can go to prison for misgendering someone. This was the hill that he was going to die on. And he got into massive arguments with students and even got censored by his university. And he's then said that it's part of cultural Marxism, this grand conspiracy of Marxism. Like, first off, criticism of sexism and racism will ultimately end up in a gulag. That's the stupidest fucking thing I've heard like all night. And we've heard some pretty stupid shit tonight, right?
Yeah.
That is ridiculous. And Jordan Peterson is a bright man, so he knows what he's doing with this. This is ultimate dog whistles. Now, did C16 say that you can go to prison for misgendering somebody? No, it didn't. What it did was add the category of transgender to forms. So basically, job applications, university applications, any application form, it was male, female, trans. What do you identify as? And the rule came in that basically you cannot discriminate against somebody for being trans, meaning that basically now it's a protected category of person. So if you saw them and went, wow, this person's massively qualified for this job, trans, no, thank you, and threw the CV away, that would be illegal because there's no good reason to persecute that person just for being trans. Can you go to prison for it? No, you can't. It was incorporated into hate speech laws, but in such a way that basically it becomes a protected status. So the best way to explain this is if you were trans and you wanted to be called Mrs. and I kept calling you Mr. All right, Mr. Doing it once isn't illegal. Doing it a lot of times becomes harassment.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the same way that I can drive past your house, Brent, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I drive past your house slowly every 10 minutes, that becomes harassment. And what Jordan Peterson has done is either misunderstood that or knowingly manipulated that in order to get purchase in the alt-right media world. The other thing is that basically he says that it was postmodern and it was started by Derrida. Now, aside from the fact that Jürgen Habermas, who basically led the Frankfurt School after Adorno, is considered one of the world's most prominent critics of postmodernism. And so it's very doubtful that those two things are connected. And the biggest fact that shows that these two things are not connected is the fact that they are in no way connected. That's the big sort of problem with his theory. What Derrida said, right? Derrida came up with the concept of deconstruction, right? And he said that the close reading of text to demonstrate that any given text has irreconcilably contradictory meanings rather than being a unified logical whole. So what Derrida said is, let's take a sentence, the black man married the white woman. We all know what's going on in there. Well, what Derrida said is that basically in any civilization, there's subtle hierarchies that become apparent. So man is superior to woman. In this context, black is superior to white. Married is superior to not married. And basically, there's all these unconscious biases within society. So that phrase, the black man asked the white woman to marry her, there's all sorts of connotations. For example, is a black person allowed to marry a white woman? It instantly shows you that the man is superior in that society to the woman and that society favors marriage. But what if that ask is a forced marriage or an arranged marriage? What he's basically saying is that there's always hidden context in words, and that by basically deconstructing things, what it does, if you go far enough, is it exposes the inequalities in any given society. So what Jordan Peterson has done there is gone, deconstruction, equality. I've seen those words in Marxism. It's Marxism. What Jordan Peterson has done is he's gone, oh, tennis has got nets and balls and men wearing shorts. Football has got nets and balls and men wearing shorts. They're the same thing. They're exactly the same thing. And they're not the same thing. This bullshit about it's a new type of Marxism because we will move it from class and economics into race and gender. That's not fucking Marxism there.
No, it's not the same bloody thing.
Yeah, we'll take the football and we'll move it to the swimming pool. Well, then it's not football anymore. It might have similar characteristics on the surface. That's a swimming pun. But it's fundamentally different. It's not the same thing. So again, it's intellectually dishonest for Jordan Peterson to be making that argument. And here's the thing. He's clever enough to know that he's wrong. Right. The Great Replacement. I mean, this is very, very simple and straightforward. It's based on lies and bullshit. Well, there's two things that are wrong with this, right? One, it's not going to replace you, is it? You're still going to be there. You know, if you've got a concern about this, my advice is stay white, have a white kid, teach that white kid to hate all the things that you hate, and then you die. That's it, problem solved. This idea of the Great Replacement comes from a misreading of statistics. It said that if current trends pervade, in 2050, white people will be 49% of population in Europe and in America. And there's two things. It's like, well, three things. One, so. Two, you're still the most prevalent type. And three, those trends aren't going to continue. What they've done is they've taken the steepest possible axis on a graph and gone, well, if this continues to happen indefinitely and that continues to not happen indefinitely, well, bloody hell.
Yeah.
It's literally bullshit. The worst example of this is the Kalergi program, which is the idea that Kalergi was behind this idea to flood Europe with a mongrel race, in his own words, of mixed people. Kalergi was a white supremacist. Again, this is one of those things which relies on people not reading the books. Kalergi was a white supremacist that wanted to put a wall around the edge of Europe to keep Europe white and Christian. And he says this in the books, in these books where they've supposedly quoted from. This is what he says. He then says that basically what he wants to use is Africa to be a slave continent for the white man, because essentially black people are animals and they don't have the mental capacity to have culture. So when he says that thing about the man of the future will be mixed race, there's two things. That finishes, he goes, the man of the future will be mixed race. The racial classes of today will gradually disappear due to the elimination of space-time prejudice. The Eurasian Negroid race of the future, similar in appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the current diversity of peoples and the diversity of individuals. That's not what he's saying that he wants to happen. That's what he's really worried will happen. And that's why he thinks that they should put a wall around the edge of Europe. And then the next bit that says, instead of destroying European Judaism, is from 3 chapters later, and they mash it together to make it look like it's a Jewish plot. And that bit is not actually referring to, there's going to be loads of Jews in Europe. He's referring to actions taken in the French Revolution towards Jews. It's nonsense. And Kalergi himself wasn't a Jew as well. That's something that's put around. Oh, and that Pan-European League? The big thing was that basically there's this society in Europe, the European Society Kuhnhoff Kalergi and the Pan-European League. And these are basically desperate for multiculturalism. This is from the Pan-European League. We are Christian. Christian-motivated thought and action are the only alternative to the inhumane ideologies of Marxism and Islamic fundamentalism, as well as to other sectarian documents of salvation. For almost 2,000 years, Christianity shaped Europe. Therefore, Europe will be Christian, or Europe won't be Europe anymore. This is apparently the organisation that wants to encourage multiculturalism and mixed race. Again, it boils down to people just not reading the actual thing. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Like John Peterson did a debate with Slavoj Žižek, and he just owned him in one sentence. What he said was, all this cultural Marxism, this neo-Marxism you talk about, which, political correctness and blah, 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 blah. I have one question for you. Where are the Marxists? Where are the Marxists? Where are the actual Marxists saying this? Where are any Marxists? Where's any evidence of Marxists actually saying this? And he followed this up, Slavoj. What he said is, what the conservative alt-right deplores as the ethical disintegration of our lives, feminism, PC culture, LGBT, etc., must have an external source because it cannot, for them, emerge out of the antagonisms and tensions of our own society. So basically what he's saying is that, they don't want to admit that these are organic things, that these are just people. There's no agenda behind this. This is just changing of society and people. But they don't like these particular people. So what they want to do is they want to justify it. They want to use it in such a way that can be seen as an intellectual argument rather than a bigoted argument. And to come on to that, let's go on to Christopher Ruffo and critical race theory. Well, involved in critical race theory is the idea of white privilege, okay? Involved in the Great Replacement theory is the idea the white race will be replaced.
Yeah.
Like, if you want a perfect example of white privilege, we don't even have genocide in our genocide. Our genocides are even better than black people's genocides, right? That's the best example of white privilege that I can see. White privilege isn't that you get something extra. It's that you don't get that other thing taken away. Right? White privilege, everybody has hard lives. I appreciate that people have horrible, hard lives. Do you think your life would be better or worse if you were Asian or black? In your current circumstance, oh, well, it'd be much better because they get bloody everything, don't they? Bloody stuff and blah, blah, blah. No, they don't. No, they don't. There's institutional racism. There's getting stopped because you match the description. There's taxis going past you. There's stop and search laws. There's stereotypes that are so deeply lasered into our psyche that even people who are perfectly like anti-racist have still got these stereotypes floating around because it's part of culture. This is the thing about political correctness and free speech and wokeism and stuff like that. People think, oh, it's just an assault on free speech. It's not an assault on free speech. You can say whatever you want, okay? It's just that sometimes there are consequences of that. And you know what really gets on my nerves about this whole free speech argument? Okay, is when someone gets cancelled off Twitter or someone gets cancelled off the television or whatever. It's never, ever, 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 ever a political argument. It's a capitalistic argument. It's because the only reason that David Icke and Trump and people like that got knocked off Twitter was because it was starting to hit Twitter's bottom line. It was starting to basically get to the point where it was turning off more people than it was turning on. And at that point, when profit comes into it, that's when people start getting cancelled. Cancellation has never got anything to do with ideology. It's to do with the impression that it gives to the institutions that are connected to it. And 9 times out of 10, people that are cancelled aren't really cancelled. They're just called out for a shitty take on something, and then they continue to work. Yeah. Like, I was looking at a list of people who were cancelled in 2021, and every single one of them was still working apart from Marilyn Manson. And he appeared on the new Kanye West album. So it's like, I don't know what cancelled actually means anymore. Anyway, so critical race theory, the idea, his problem was that basically CRT thinks that racism is systemic. It is. I hate to tell you this, but it is. It just is. Yeah. Like, segregation only ended in the 50s in America. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's huge amounts of racism. Black people on television until relatively recently was actually a rarity. Like, the idea that there is no systematic racism is just ridiculous. Does that make any of us a bad person? No. No, it doesn't. Can race drive belief? Yes, of course it can. Now, this can work on both sides of the racial spectrum. To think that you're superior, then of course race can drive belief. Or to think that you're inferior. Yes, white privilege is a thing. It's not that you get something. It's that you don't get that extra thing taken away. And the system is biased towards whites. It is. It is absolutely biased towards whites. Like, this is not even something to be debated, really. Now, Ibram X. Kendi, who he quoted, isn't a critical race theorist. They're involved in anti-racist works, not critical race. So the only person that he can find to tie it to Marxism isn't even actually connected to the theory. But Ruffo admitted that it was all bullshit, much in the same way that Weyrich actually admitted it. He said, him and social conservatives have been fighting against progressive ideology without being able to describe it effectively. Because the thing is, right, in order to fight something, you need to name it. You need to give it something that people can attach itself to. It doesn't have to be real, but it needs something that people can recognize. And so he said, we need a new language for these issues. Political correctness is a dated term and, more importantly, doesn't apply anymore. It's not that elites are enforcing a set of manners and cultural limits. They're seeking to re-engineer the foundation of human psychology and social institutions through the new politics of race. It's much more invasive than mere correctness, which is a mechanism of social control, but not the heart of what is happening. The other frames are wrong too. Cancel culture is a vacuous term and doesn't translate into the political program. Woke is a good epithet, but it's too broad, too terminal, too easily brushed aside. Critical race theory is the perfect villain. So what Christopher Ruffo is doing there is admitting that the culture war, the war on woke, cancel culture, all of these moans that the right wing have, they're bullshit.
They're not bastard.
Real. Absolutely. And what he's done is said that critical race theory is the perfect villain. It's the perfect encapsulation of this vacuous idea. It's not real, but he can use it. If critical race theory is the villain, is he admitting that racism is the hero? Pretty much. Now, he said that critical race theory came from Marcuse. Marcuse died in 1979. Critical race theory didn't start until 1989. So, with the best will in the world, even with all those Jewish Marxist astute scientists, I think it would be pretty difficult for Marcuse to have had any influence on the beginnings of critical race theory.
No.
So again, it's just again another utter lie, basically.
Because it was Kimberly Crenshaw.
Mm.
She's the law professor who came up with critical race theory. And she
yes,
came up with intersectionality afterwards.
Yeah.
Intersectionality was the progression from her original thesis of critical race theory.
There's 2 points about critical race theory. It's such a niche topic that, again, like Marxism, unless you're doing very, very distinct things in university, it's never going to cross your path.
No.
And the second thing is that shit like this proves that critical race theory is needed. The trope about critical race theory being bad just goes to prove that critical race theory is accurate. Because, again, it's the demonization of black people for something that they haven't done. It's staggering society for the whites. It's moving the argument away from what's happening to something intangible.
Absolutely.
Right. We're on to the last one now. The trans agenda. Now, again, this is just horrible. There is no agenda. There is just no agenda to influx trans people or to change people to become trans. And I've heard all sorts of reasons that it might happen. One, because something to do with the Illuminati, like hermaphrodites. I even heard that, well, there's a lot of money to be made in sex change operations. Maybe that's the plot to, generate some of that snippy snip income. It's like, are you mental? Are you absolutely mental?
You'd have to be, wouldn't you?
The trans identity, the concept of trans identity is far older than people give it credit for, right? Okay, the thing that I keep hearing is, if it's everywhere all of a sudden and you never heard of it before, it's an agenda. It's like, you never heard of Quentin Crisp? Have you never heard of hydras? Have you never heard of the point being that basically it's like thousands and thousands of years old. And again, the concept of gender has been fluid throughout society, throughout history. What was acceptable in ancient Rome is probably not acceptable now, but was considered the norm. Alexander the Great didn't consider himself gay, but he had a lot of sex with his best friend because that was what they did at the time. There's also a fundamental misunderstanding of the terms sex, sexuality, and gender. And this isn't helped by the fact that they're sort of used interchangeably. Like, gender reassignment surgery should be called sex reassignment surgery because sex is your genitals, essentially. Sexuality is who you fancy. And gender is a social construct. Gender is an idea of how masculine or feminine you are. And I'm sure that we can all agree that basically, both of you got beards, right? So you're instantly more masculine than I am. Okay, that's not a bad thing, but if we're talking on a scale of masculinity, I'd say you two guys were more masculine than me, right? Okay, so in gender terms, I suppose I'm more feminine than you guys, at least in a facial hair thing. You'd say that...
But I've got longer hair.
Oh, you see? But this is the point. These things change. When I was at school, no bloke would be caught dead wearing a pink shirt because they'd probably be beaten up. Nowadays, it's quite the in thing among the kids, I've heard. So this is the point. Everything changes. Now, is there a discussion to be had about trans? Yes, of course there is, because there's all sorts of things. I'm very, very aware of there's concerns about, say, things like changing rooms and toilets and sports and stuff like that. And of course, there's the concern that some people are too keen for this. It's almost become cool and trendy. When I was at school...
That's ridiculous, though.
Well, it is and it isn't, right? Because basically, when I was at school, it was suddenly very, very sort of in for all the girls to pretend to be lesbians for about 6 months. It was just cool. I forget who it was. There was some cool lesbian on television, and suddenly everybody wanted to be a lesbian for a bit. So there are some idiots that will basically be sort of more inclined to do that because they want to be hip and because Tarquin, those same people that basically, my kid's not thick, he's definitely got dyslexia, and it's like, I'm afraid he hasn't. He's just thick. Those kinds of parents might be inclined to sort of to make them seem more interesting. But this is why the discussion about it needs to be made, because if that is happening, then there needs to be tighter sort of checks on it. I don't believe for a second personally that is happening on a mass scale, that loads of people, doctors are like, come on in, kids, let's get you on some hormone blockers and stuff like that. I think it's massively, massively over-exaggerated.
It's not a first choice of a doctor to just suddenly chuck treatment of that nature towards people whatsoever.
No, it's very difficult to actually get, isn't it? I know of more people that have been turned down for it than I know of people that have been allowed allowed. That sounds horrible, but you know what I mean. Like, I only know 2 trans people, and I know of 3 people that were refused it. There is an argument potentially when it comes to sport or something like that. But again, it's not really an argument, it's a discussion. Like the recent thing, for example, right, is that Leah Thompson is that swimmer. And everyone claimed that, like, she's so tall, she's got shoulders and blah, blah, blah. She's just going to destroy the rest of the group and stuff. It's like, yeah, but she didn't, though, did she? She competed in 3 events. She won one, came 5th in another, and came 8th in another. During that event, there were 27 records broken. 27. She didn't break a single one. Now, apparently, when you go through hormone replacement treatment like she has, even though you retain the sort of bulk, this is the wrong expression, but it can wither the muscle. So basically, you're not as strong as you were. You don't have the testosterone levels. And in some events, having a larger bulk but lower muscle density could actually be a detriment because you're carrying more weight, or there's more sort of like air resistance or water resistance or whatever. So here's the thing, like, I don't know what the answer is in sport. But there needs to be a conversation, and there needs to be a conversation that's done compassionately. And it's not about, oh, she can't be in it, she used to have a cock. There needs to be a definition of basically what is it that gives that advantage. Is it the frame? Is it the testosterone? Then you get into all sorts of things like, well, can Usain Bolt not, because of his freakishly long legs, is he not allowed to be in sport? Now, again, there's all sorts of arguments because, like, say, there's Laurel Hubbard, who's the woman that was the weightlifter, and everyone thought that she was going to destroy the competition, and she got knocked out the first round. There's been various sort of tennis matches through the years to sort of see what the answer is to this. There was Margaret Court versus Bobby Riggs, and Margaret Court was number 1 in the world. Bobby Riggs was about 400, and he beat her. But then he lost to Billie Jean King, although to add some mystery to it, it was always suggested that he threw that because he was in debt to the mafia. Martina Navratilova lost to Jimmy Connors, and a bloke called Karsten Breach, who was 203rd in the world, beat both Williams sisters in the same afternoon. So the argument, like in the sports realm, that, well, then it's obvious, isn't it? Male have an advantage. So a trans woman would have retained some of those advantages. But apparently it's simply just not as clear as that, aside from the sort of the muscle factor and the weight factor. There's all sorts of things. For example, Karsten said that the way that he beat her was because she wasn't used to sort of like aggressive backspin and certain techniques that are very common in the man's game. And there's 2 ways of looking at that. One, you could look at it and basically say, well, there you go. Men, they can do those techniques. Women can't. That's it. QED, men are better. Well, not necessarily, because if that's just not done in the women's sport, how could you ever get good at that? You know, you sharpen steel with steel. Actually, you don't. That wouldn't work. But anyway, you've got to play against people who are better than you. And if you're not never given that opportunity to do it, you're never going to progress. So it is an interesting conversation, and there's a debate to be had there. But that debate isn't to be had by people on the internet.
That's
right?
what I was going to say.
Yeah, there needs to be a political angle to it, a scientific angle to it. And you know what? They might come out and say, I'm ever so sorry, but you can't be in it. I'm very sorry.
We can say the debate is to be had, right? There's a debate to be had. And, you know, that's not for people on the internet or Ben Shapiro to have this debate. Who should have this debate is the sports boards. And I think they've already had that debate. That's why there are trans women allowed in certain sports.
Yeah.
But they're just using this as a football. They're using it.
Exactly. Well, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's taking something that we don't like or makes us afraid, attaching it to something else in the concept of the cultural Marxism theory, so that I'm not being bigoted. Like, it comes from 2 things. One, 9 times out of 10, not for everybody. Some people are concerned with the sport, but when it comes to the cultural Marxism, it boils down to 2 things. One, this stupid idea that women shouldn't be stronger than men, and it's like it's against my fragile male ego. And 2, the worry that basically, if I show even the slightest bit of sympathy or understanding for the trans condition, other men might think I'm gay. And further to complicate that, in North Carolina, for 2 years running, girls have won the males wrestling, all-state championship wrestling. Now, wrestling is one of those things where you'd assume that man's physicality would ultimately beat women. In 2020, Heaven Fitch, and in 2022, June Welsh, they both won the wrestling tournament, and they won it outright. So there is a conversation to be had. I'll tell you the thing that gets on my tits about the whole thing. Probably not the best phrase for this.
I just thought that.
I'll tell you what gets on my nerves, Brent, is the idea that there's a load of mediocre male sportsmen out there with a pair of scissors, like just sat there going, this is the only way I'm going to beat it. Like, do you want to be a star? Come on, this is how you're going to do it. This is how we get to the top. Press-ups and all that, like, you know, drinking eggs like Rocky, that's only going to take me so far.
I don't want to see that montage.
I'm getting into a bath of ice. And like, yeah, exactly. So this is the point. So I think we can pretty safely say the entire thing is nonsense. Here's the thing, right? Okay, there's no through line. There's no evidence to support the theory. There's no evidence that it's connected to Marxism. It doesn't line up with Marxism. There's no line of evidence connecting it to any of the Marxists. None of those Marxists said anything like what is in the theory. It has no reference to the source material, and it relies on you believing that people are a threat because they happen to be black, foreign, gay, or trans. That's what the theory is about. It's absolute bullshit.
There's a lot of similarities between far-right groups and the ones that are separated from conspiracy theories already. They're still very similar to their core, and it's just recycled nonsense. A lot. Yeah. They're just putting labels on it. At least the likes of Tommy Robinson and that, they're just like, nah, I don't like this lot.
Yeah. They're honest in their bigotry, aren't they? It's this dog whistle hiding behind it, pretending it's something that isn't.
Yeah, he doesn't think he's as racist as he actually is. He still thinks he's onto something, which they all do to varying degrees. But I mean, I do want to watch his documentary, to be honest with you, just because I want to see. He's done a talk at, I think it was Harvard or Oxford. And although you don't go away agreeing with him, if you watch it, you can at least better understand how he's drawn his conclusions. It's about where he's from.
What actually happened was he tried to go out with an Asian girl and she rebuffed him. And after that, he became very far right.
I mean, that's probably likely to be a factor, to be honest. You know, he was an ex-hooligan. I know people from the Midlands and stuff like that where they've been attacked because they're white. That doesn't happen where I'm from.
There's always, people are shits, aren't they? And like people will find any reason to collect in groups and to oppress other people if it makes them feel powerful. It's just one of the sad things about the human condition, really, isn't it? Like, and the thing about his Oxford speech, that's the thing about propaganda. He's got to have a degree of truth to it or a degree of something that you can latch onto. If you think about it like poison, like there's no point me coming up to you with a bowl of shit with some poison laced into it because you're just not going to eat it. I'm going to have to put it into a pie or something like that, something palatable so that it goes in. But what Tommy Robinson does is sort of typical of the cultural Marxism perspective. What is this that you don't like? And there's these areas where basically, like, due to the economic, ethnic, or just the fact that you're not from that hood, right, okay, if you walk through it, you're going to feel nervous, right, okay? And sometimes there's a racial element to that because there tends to be an element of ghettoisation, particularly say Nottingham, right, okay, like there's areas that there are sort of poorer areas, just so happen to be a lot of black and Asian people there as well. And if you're walking through them, sometimes they can be very, very intimidating. So these are things that everybody can sort of like go, I have an experience of that. And they'll track that back and then pull on that thread, you pull on that thread, you pull on that thread until all of a sudden it's a Marxist plot to flood the world with black people.
But wouldn't Marx being implemented correctly actually cure that problem?
Well, here's the thing, right? Okay, immigration is a product of capitalism. Why are we bringing them in? We're not bringing them in for cultural reasons. We're not bringing them in like it was for them to work in the factories. So this is the point. Although capitalism has been racist, slavery, for example, it isn't inherently racist. It doesn't care. It's about profit. Right. So we've just got the last bit, which is the real source of where this came from. And I appreciate we've been going for a long time, so I shan't dilly-dally. There's a series of sources, and it goes backwards, and it's not pretty. The most recent expression of this is basically the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was obviously After the war, the Soviet Union was still a thing. It's opposed to capitalism. It's seen as a huge military power. And there were various things that basically gave the impression, probably the real impression, that Soviet communism was a threat to the West still. And these are things like the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. These were all America versus Russia, or Russia by proxy. And the idea was that it was capitalism versus communism. So with that in mind, it's not difficult to use communism / Marxism as a boogeyman. The second thing was None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which is the book that our podcast is named after. This was from Gary Allen in 1971. It claims that communism wants to create income tax, create central banks, create a national debt, and through that national debt, force people to go to war. Those are all products of capitalism. Basically, again, it's nonsense. The book implies that it's a Jewish plot, that the people who backed Marx were Jewish, that Marx was Jewish and he wasn't. It misrepresents tragedy and hope by saying, basically, look, this isn't a crackpot theory. Even Tragedy and Hope says that there's this cabal of secret men running the planet. And he implies that Tragedy and Hope, which is written by Carol Quigley, says it's the same people. Carol Quigley makes it very clear that that in that book that it's talking about the British Empire, specifically Cecil Rhodes and the British aristocracy. And so it's certainly not talking about Jews. And also Gary Allen claims that the Nazis were communist because they used socialism, National Socialist. Socialist is communist, hence they're communist. Oh. And he seems to ignore the fact that they fought against communists. They destroyed union and labour and workers' rights. They were absolutely corporatist. They built up massive corporations like T.S. and Steel and such like that. So it's just utter nonsense. Where he gets that from? Oh, he also claims that it's the Rothschilds. It's just the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds finance every war, and they're just behind everything that's bad that's ever happened in the world. Now, his entire theory is pinned on one quote. Lenin said that the establishment of a central bank is 90% of communizing a nation. And can you believe Lenin didn't say that? What Lenin said was, capitalism has created an accounting apparatus in the shape of banks, syndicates, postal services, consumer services, and employee unions. Without big banks, socialism would be impossible. Big banks are state apparatus which we need to bring about socialism, and which we will take the ready-made models from capitalism. Our task is to top off what capitalistically mutilates these fine apparatus. So he's not saying that you need a central bank. He's saying, seeing as we've got this central bank, that would be a good way of distributing wages. And essentially, capitalism has got 90% of the infrastructure that we need for a society. He goes on to say, we're going to make it even more bigger, more democratic, even more comprehensive. Quantity will be transferred into quality. A single state bank, the biggest of the big, with branches in every rural district, in every factory, will constitute as much as 9/10 of the socialist apparatus. So that's where he's got the 90%. It's a completely dishonest reading of what Lenin was saying. Further back than that, and slightly more sinister, it comes from CoIntelPro. Now, CoIntelPro was the FBI program to basically, let's not beat around the bush, murder communists. Because again, born out of the idea of the Cold War jeg, who have genuinely thought that basically communists were a threat. He also didn't like black people. He was also a cross-dresser. So that's an interesting take on this. But what he said was that the civil rights movements were infiltrated by Marxists, and so he was able to smear Malcolm X, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the burgeoning Black Panther movement, and Martin Luther King. And one of the things he said was, in the light of Martin Luther King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now, if we've not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation, from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. So again, it's just utter nonsense. It's trying to say we're taking something that we don't like. In this case, it's the civil rights movement, and we're tying it unfairly to communism because it is just not true. Prior to that, you had McCarthyism, which was Senator McCarthy. He said there were 57 communists in Congress and his job was to root them out. And it was literally a witch hunt. It was actually supported by a very unpleasant man, Roy Cohn. And part of this was the execution of the Rosenbaums, Ethel and Joseph Rosenbaum, who were executed for being communist spies. And essentially they were probably guilty, but were railroaded by Roy Cohn into being executed by the state. Prior to that, we have Frank L. Britton with his book Behind Communism. And I'll just summarize it very, very quickly. It's the Jews. It's the Jews. According to Frank L. Britton, it's the Jews. The Jews are to blame. Communism is Jewish. And FDR and Churchill were Jews. And any idea that the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic is a hoax, a cleverly formulated smokescreen that the Jews did. And the protocols of the Elders of Zion are real, and the Jews are behind everything. And what he really bases this on is the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolshevik Revolution was in 1917, was the Communist Revolution. Bolsheviks were one type of communist. The Mensheviks were another type. The Bolsheviks became dominant and they overthrew the Russian state. They murdered the Tsar and took over the country and returned the means of production back to the proletariat. And this has become like the common trope that underpins the idea of tying Marxism to Jewish people, Jewish Bolshevism. The only problem is that basically of the Bolshevik Revolution, only 5% of them were Jewish. And of the central leadership, only 5% of them were Jewish. So the problem is, again, that basically this is a trope, a truism that is not true. Now, the first person in the alternative media to mention the concept of cultural Bolshevism and to spread that was somebody who influenced all sorts of people, including Jordan Maxwell and Tex Mars, Nesta Webster. Now, Nesta Webster was a very early proponent of the Grand Conspiracy, believed again that the Jews were behind everything and that the protocols of Zion were real. Now, she gets quoted by quite a lot of people, doesn't she, Brent?
Oh, she sure does. Yeah, the John Birch Society published all of her books.
Is that right?
Yes, republished all of her
Weyrich
books.
is of the John Birch Society. Christopher Ruffo is of the Heritage Society and the IEA, which is an offshoot of the John Birch Society. William Lind was of the John Birch Society. Walt Heyer is of the Heritage Foundation, which is connected to the John Birch Society. So, and the John Birch Society was also where Gary Allen came from. Mm-hmm. And they were viciously anti-communist. Anti-communist, there's two types of anti-communist. People who are afraid of communists, and anti-communist as a euphemism for Nazi. Not pejorative, proper Nazi. And in all of those organizations, there were both of those. Like the World Anti-Communist League, which has got direct connections to the Heritage Foundation and the Council for National Policy, runs death squads in South America, Nazi death squads. Like, this is the thing. And ultimately, the whole theory ties back to cultural Bolshevism. Now, here's the thing. Bolshevism was the Marxist group, but Bolshevism became, in the Nazi ideology, intricately connected to the idea of Jewish. So they became an interchangeable idea. So Jewish Bolshevism, cultural Bolshevism, cultural Jewishness, it's all the same thing. Now, this is really stupid, but the Nazis felt that in the early 20s that modern art and Bauhaus architecture, which is flat edges and functional and a bit Art Deco, but just like flat, big glass walls and stuff like that, they felt that that was a Jewish plot to ruin Germany. Bauhaus architecture and modern art, and it was Jewish. And it was also tied in with the sort of, in Germany at the time, there was a sort of a gay scene and burgeoning sort of LGBT and stuff like that. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Cabaret, but that kind of thing. Marlene Dietrich was sort of toying with dressing as a man and certain things like that. But essentially, again, the idea of cultural Bolshevism was that it was a Jewish/Bolshevik, because they're interchangeable, plot to undermine German culture and its values. Now, this is a quote that describes cultural Bolshevism. If Bolshevism is not only anti-bourgeois, it is anti-cultural. It means in the final consequence the absolute destruction of all economic, social, state, cultural and civilizing advances made by Western civilization for the benefit of the rootless and nomadic international clique of conspirators who have found their representation international Jewry. Now, to me, that sounds almost identical, because it is, to the description given in all of those letters and articles of cultural Marxism. It's indistinguishable. But that is actually cultural Bolshevism. Do you want to know who that quote's from? It's from that wacky, laid-back guy, Joseph Goebbels. Literally one of the most evil people on the planet is essentially, that is the framework for cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is Nazi propaganda. It's as simple as that. It's Nazi propaganda repackaged, and it's the worst type of Nazi propaganda. It is the literal propaganda that led to the Holocaust. And instead of now having Jews as the targets as well as the architects, Jews are just the architects, and the targets are black people, gay people, and trans people. And it's really, really, really disturbing to see how many people in the alternative media pick up on this and run with it and give it credence, because it's stupid. It's absolutely stupid. If anybody thinks that there's any truth to any of this theory at all, I'm very sorry, but you're just a moron, right? Or you're a bigot that's trying to justify terrible takes in order to come across as not being bigoted.
Yeah, you're trying to intellectualize your bigotry.
Exactly. And it's just cowardly. You know, if you want to be a bigot, be a bigot. I don't care if you want to be a bigot. But don't try and sort of like, oh, I'm not a bigot. I'm a patriot. I'm fighting against this international cadre of Jewish Marxist theorists that are trying to undermine Western culture by teaching my kid to cut his cock off. It's the most ridiculous and stupid theory. And it's really, I just hate it. Because A, it justifies hate. And B, it's insulting to the person that it's aimed at, by which I mean the audience, not the black person or the Jewish person or the gay person, though obviously it is. It's saying, we think you are so stupid that you're not even going to check what we're going to say to you. Like, we're just going to say this in order to basically get something really horrible going. And to justify their own bigotry. They know that you're not going to go and actually pick up that book and read it and go, oh, Andrew Breitbart was lying to me. Oh, Jordan Peterson was lying to me. Oh, all the people who've mentioned cultural Marxism were lying to me. That's what they think of you. Yeah, I'm glad we did this show because, like I said, the theory really gets on my nerves.
I'm just sort of processing it all, really, to be honest, because it's all new and it's all a lot.
Sorry, there was a huge amount with that, but I thought that we needed to, give it a fair whack. I've found that basically this is why, again, we want to do this program, is that when you're looking at stuff, the best way to sort of drill into it is to go to the source. Where did this start? We can then appraise the evidence, but you need to always go back to the source, because finding the source of these things is incredibly revealing. And finding that essentially the source of this is a literal repackaging of Nazi propaganda. Not being hysterical, but like, the Nazis were bad guys, you know. They were not cool hombres. To find that it is, and that people, again, who are sort of well-meaning, and particularly a lot of these people who spread this see themselves as coming from this love and light community and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it's not. It's ridiculous, hateful nonsense packaged up in the thinnest veneer of academia.
Yeah, it does. There's a few times I do just think this sounds quite a lot like Nazi Germany sort of mentality, and just causes need an enemy. I haven't read Mein Kampf, but from what I understand, basically it's because of the economic situation in Germany, wasn't it? That he got worked up and jealous and claimed socialist and wasn't, but then the right person basically thought he's a great spokesperson, put him with his charisma. I don't even understand that explanation, though, to be honest.
Mein Kampf was quite interesting because in it, he basically says, I'm going to use the Jews as a scapegoat because basically they're easy to utilise as a scapegoat. And he sort of kind of explains what his tactics are going to be like 10 years before he sort of did it. It's very strange. I've read Mein Kampf. Practically tells you what he's going to do. Lays it out that it's a technique that he's going to use to get you on his side. Very strange.
Well, I suppose once you've accepted that, though, and then he does it, you know.
This is the problem, right? Okay, the world is chaotic and there's lots of stuff going off and it's hard for everybody. If you can find somebody that is a target and a cause for this, it makes the world more palatable, right? If it's immigration, then at least you know there's something tangible that's causing the problems in your life. If it's black people getting all the social help, then at least you've got something that you can rally against. If it's a secret cadre of Jews, then at least there's something that you can rally against. In a bizarre way, these ridiculously convoluted and complicated things, they simplify the world for people. They give you something to focus on that basically means that it takes away elements of doubt, and by which I mean the sort of unfairness and unpredictability of life. Like, if you're scared that an Asian family's moved next door to you, it's easier for you to think that basically, oh, that's part of this plot, isn't it? Than just, oh, this is something I'm going to have to deal with or whatever. It's just a projection, as I say. People like to be able to have closed loops, and they like to be able to understand things. And this is where the line between propaganda and conspiracy theories and grifters becomes really, really dangerous, because there's a load of people who know that, and they're going to offer you those answers. But those answers aren't going to be beneficial for you. They're going to be beneficial for them.
Yeah, it's the same. There's a lot of similarities with rallying somebody for a legitimate political party as well, even just the Conservatives or Labour or Republicans, Democrats. This whole world and all our interactions is made up of just a form of psychology that can be analysed and manipulated to varying degrees. If you work it out, I feel like I could be resilient to any sort of bullshit these days, you know what I mean? Like, I never, not completely ever, even I've noticed there's things over the last few years that I sort of thought for a little bit at first, and then because I've got experience, once they've gone in 5% into their whatever it is, I've gone, I see what you're trying to do there, you know, and I almost kind of look at the world like that these days. Like, even just political commentators, they want following on Twitter. You know, I don't really want to do political stuff on Twitter, like political comedy on Twitter. But although I know it would be really beneficial for my views and coverage and networking and stuff, because a lot of people would see it, a lot of people would share it. It's something that gets people's backs up. You know,
there's money in outrage, mate. Like, you know, where there's muck, there's brass, and there's nothing more mucky than outrage, is there? Like, yeah. You know.
Some of them are, not all of them are doing it for bad, you know, like these other comedians that I do see that are doing their videos that are political basis, like they're exposing the shit show that is the Conservative government, rather than they're not grifting people in deceitfully. A video game taught me this. Do you guys play games?
Yeah.
The Last of Us 2.
Yeah.
In one person's story, you're the hero. Your story, you're the hero, and the other person's you're the villain. And that's the same with the Conservative supporters, Brexit supporters, Remainers, Leavers, Labour voters, you know, the Greens, every single race, and conspiracy as well. Most conspiracy theorists, they think they're the good guys. They're exposing, because we all know the governments are shit.
Yeah,
but they're accusing them of being 10 times shitter than what they are in reality.
they're accusing them of being shit on purpose rather than being shit by nature.
Yeah, well, again, that's always my argument against conspiracy from government. It's just like, let me get this straight. You reckon the geezer that couldn't cover up, he had a party in his own flat and couldn't convincingly worm his way out of that one, aka Boris Johnson, and Bill Clinton, who couldn't cover up that he got a blowjob off of an intern, you saying those two fellas that we all reckon are really selfish and self-centered and self-serving, they're willing to coordinate this massive elaborate plan to their own detriment in the long run. They basically have to sell themselves out, ruin their legacies for someone else's gain. What that really selfish cunt is going to do all this for the gain of this shadow government or things of that nature. I like constructing conspiracies as a logistics thing.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the flat Earth firmament as an example. Right? Let's argument's sake, with the Earth's flat and there's a dome. That dome would get scratched. There's a company subcontracted to maintaining that dome. Because if they don't...
No. NASA nanobots. Simple.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I think they would even go further. Well, there is no such thing as space, so it can't get hit by an asteroid. It's like, all right, fine. Should we not go down that way? At some point, it's going to get damaged a little bit. A bird's going to fly too high. You know, a baseball's going to get fucking whacked out into near orbit. But it's going to crack the dome a little bit. So you've got to have a maintenance team. And they're going to need to have shift patterns. And those people are going to have to never, ever, ever, when they leave this job in engineering, they're going to have to commit to keeping it all a secret in the first place and never talk about it afterwards, after they leave. Presumably, it's a sort of thing like oil rigs where they all have to go and live on site and that sort of thing. So there's a bit of a network of living quarters and a small infrastructure for people to eat and, you know, receive resources. So someone's delivering the food and beverages that it takes and the female sanitary products. Like, I want to know who does the tampons for the maintenance. You know what I mean?
There'll be one group that's got the contract, and they'll be constantly going from wherever it is near the firmament to the ice wall and back, just constantly delivering stuff. Like, and that's why people never get bored, because if you're bored of working on the firmament, then you can go and work on the ice wall for a bit. It is a live contract, and yes, you don't get to tell anybody.
Are you? Because what do you do? Are you then, like, if you decide you want to have children, have a family, you meet someone else on the dome, and you have children with them, you're gonna resign those kids. It's like having kids on Mars, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's say there's children there amongst the community. What it's like, starting to look like Alexandria in The Walking Dead at this point, where they've got a little church, they've got the mums like doing the homeschooling and stuff, and like these kids are going to have to like get educated somehow. Like, you know,
it's just sad, really, isn't it, that we haven't moved on?
No.
Now, people always think of, I think me and Brent were talking about this before you came on, people always think of the worst
case scenario, yeah.
Yeah, so for example, an Islamophobe will be thinking, Tom Robinson in his head, he is thinking of Muslim grooming gangs.
Yeah.
He always thinks of them, or people who follow him always think of that extreme. And left-wing people, when they get worked up about it, left-wing people, I consider myself centre-left, so I know them better than the others. But they always think of right-wing people as Tommy Robinson and Britain first, and like, you know, massive racists. And I've got loads of friends who are through the debunker community in the States that I respect a lot. They're really intelligent people, and they vote Trump.
Right.
If you were to believe what we get over in Britain about Donald Trump, there's nothing good about him. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I know what we all think of this, what we all think after hearing everything. One last question, really, is what would Brian think of this?
Good one. You know what? Brian's actually always been staunchly leave the trans people and LGBT people alone. I think I've even mentioned it in a couple of, just left it alone in a couple of videos. I've covered it to the point where I'm like, well, one, you know, how I said I'd be a bit mortified if I was to ever make anything worse for anyone. If I was to ever find out that someone only saw a clip or something and that made them feel a bit worse, I wouldn't like that myself.
So what you're saying is this conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism is so ridiculous and offensive that it's too much, even for Brian Kurvie.
Basically, yeah. I've used that as a benchmark a couple of times, like as if to imply that no matter how stupid this guy is, he's got nothing against gay people. He's not you stupid kind of thing. The other conspiracy theorists, you know, that's how I get my little dig at those people on a different level in that way.
Amazing. All right, well, let's wrap this up. Do you want to tell the people where they can find you?
Can we put a link in the description sometime?
We can do that. It's on Twitter at bkurvie. That's Kurvie. And I don't know what your YouTube is. It's The Conspiracist. We'll put links below. We'll put links in the Twitter thread. Make sure when you're listening to this podcast, check the Twitter thread at SomeDarePod. It will have all the links to all the things that have featured in Neil's TED Talk.
No, sorry. He went a bit longer than we expected, just because I did too much. Sorry.
Honestly, I've got nothing else to do. But no, it's been a pleasure, guys.